Tonight, let's step back into a forgotten chapter of history.
Ow.
One you might have lived before, not as a king, or a knight, or even a scribe, but as someone quieter. Someone who walked slowly across the frost-covered floorboards of a one-room home, wrapped in a wool tunic that smelled of smoke. Someone whose world was lit by tallow and breath, not by noise or brightness. The fire is low now, not gone, just quiet. Coals pulse like a heartbeat, slow and hidden, tucked beneath the ash. The room smells of damp stone and old bread, but it's safe. Not because of locks, or guards, or certainty, but because it's night, and night holds things close. The shutters are drawn. The animals are asleep. And for a little while, so is the world. Where are you watching from? What time is it there? What did you forget to do before crawling beneath the blanket? Let the stillness reach you. Let your jaw loosen just a little. Let your breath sink into your belly like snow settling into earth. Don't force the silence. Let it arrive like a memory, like a candle being set down gently on an old table. This isn't a story you need to follow. It's one you've already known, buried somewhere between your shoulder blades and the back of your throat. It's slow, soft. It has no lesson. It's just a quiet rhythm like firewood cracking or cloth brushing against straw. Let your eyes drift, not shut. Let your thoughts wander, not land. You don't need to listen with your ears anymore, just with the part of you that dreams in old colors. Tonight, we will lie beside peasants who never knew warmth like ours. Not the kind that came from machines or wires or thick-glassed windows, but the kind that was shared, passed, preserved, the kind you fought for with your hands and your time and your breath. The world outside is cold, colder than anything most remember. The wind presses against the shutters with slow insistence, but they do not open. Inside, everything is still, except the small sounds that live at the edges of sleep. Cough, a shift in the straw, a pot settling on the coals. And someone, maybe a child, maybe a grandmother, hums something beneath their breath. Not a song, just a note that rises, pauses, and disappears. Like warmth. This home isn't grand. Its walls are packed with mud and sticks. The roof leaks in spring. The air smells of onions and old milk. But here, in the deep of winter, it's enough. It's a world wrapped in wool and habit, in rhythm and hush. Let your body soften like old linen. Let your chest rise like a loaf set near the fire. This is not the world of war. Not tonight. It is not a tale of heroes or maps or crowns. It is a story beneath the story. The part that lived behind closed doors when no one was looking. Here, a slipper was a treasure, a thick sock, a gift. A blanket passed down from mother to daughter was worth more than a ring. And the simple act of sitting close, of leaning your head on someone's arm while the fire faded, that was what survival felt like. It wasn't brave. It wasn't loud. But it was everything. The cat is curled in the corner, tucked beneath an old tunic. The dog, if there is one, lies just outside the door, its body a wall against the wind. Somewhere beyond the village, snow drapes the hills like old lace. Delicate but heavy, almost holy. The church bell won't ring until morning. The bread won't rise until the sun returns. There is only now, only this still hour where time forgets to move, where the past lingers like breath on a cold window pane. Tonight, nothing needs to be done. No fields need tending. No buckets must be filled. There is only the hush of winter's breath, brushing against stone walls that have known 1,000 nights like this. It is not special, but it is sacred. And so we begin, not with an event, or a date, or a name, but with a feeling. One you've carried before, one you carry still, curling inward, of waiting, listening to the dark and finding it gentle. Let the story hold you, the fire shrink behind your eyelids. Let sleep take your hand like a child, tugging gently toward a dream. There is nothing else now, only the cold beyond the shutter and the warmth of a world forgotten, a world where survival meant softness, not strength. And sleep was an escape, was return. The cottage stood crooked at the edge of the village, its walls woven from slender hazel rods and daubed with layers of mud, dung, and straw. In the daylight, you could see where the rain had chewed little gullies into the dried earth, where time had worn paths down the doorway like tired footprints. But at night, the walls seemed steadier. Not because they held strong, but because they held memories. And memories, like cold air, found every crack and stayed. The wind was always there, not screaming, not roaring, just breathing. It slipped under the door like an old rumor, curling around the feet of the table and the ankles of the sleeping. It whispered through the chinks in the walls, kissed the nape of the boy sleeping nearest the edge of the bed. And yet no one flinched, no one stirred. Cold was not a surprise. It was a companion. The fire had been fed twice that evening. Once with brittle wood that snapped like bones, and later with something softer, slower, peat maybe. Or roots left too long in the sun. It didn't roar, it pulsed. It lived in the center of the room, low and red, casting long shadows on the ceiling like brushstrokes in candlelight. The warmth didn't reach far, but it reached far enough. Enough to thaw fingers, enough to let the breath come easy. Their bed wasn't really a bed. It was straw, mostly layered over with burlap and old cloaks. A child's tunic here, a sheep's wool scrapped there. No mattress, no feathers. Just a hollow carved by habit and sleep, shared by 3 people and a dog with a crooked tail. The smell was sharp, sweat, soil, stale milk. But it wasn't unpleasant. It was life, dense and grounded and near. The wind outside was a different kind of alive. It moved across the hills like a spirit, lifting fine dust from the frozen fields, brushing against thatched rooftops, making the chickens shuffle in their coop. When it hit the cottage wall, it pressed in as if trying to remember what it once was. Not violent, just searching. Cold has memory, they said. It remembers where you left it. The man lying nearest the fire coughed softly once, didn't wake anyone. He pulled the woven shawl tighter across his chest, and the corners of the fabric tugged against his cracked fingers. His face was lined, but not from age. From worry, from wind. The quiet work of staying alive when the land had little to give. There was no glass in the windows, just oiled cloth stretched thin across the frames, breathing slightly with every gust. In the daylight it let the sun bleed through like honey. But now it showed only shadows. Of branches, maybe, or something older. There was no difference between the dark outside and the dark inside, except the breath on the air. A wooden spoon rested on the table, next to a bowl half filled with barley mash. Cold now, hardened around the edges. No one had the heart to scrape it clean. Food, once chewed, was precious. Even its remnants were left to sit like guests not yet dismissed. They would deal with it tomorrow when the water was less frozen and the light returned. Across from the hearth, a child stirred beneath the blanket, his knees drawn to his chest, his nose tucked beneath a fold of wool. He wasn't dreaming, not fully. But his fingers twitched against the straw, tracing invisible paths in his sleep. Paths he had walked earlier that day, down to the stream, across the garden, past the place where the fence leaned too far to the left. There were no clocks. Time moved with the fire and the cold. With the soft rise and fall of the sleeping, and the distant call of animals settling into hay, they didn't need to measure it. They felt it, in their bones, in their stomachs, in the rhythm of knowing when to wake for bread, or listen for the rooster, or pull the shawl tighter because dawn was still hours away. Sometimes, in the dead of night, one of them would rise, not to do anything, but simply to listen, to sit by the fire and listen to the wind as if it might say something. These moments weren't named, they weren't even remembered, but they stitched the night together like thread through rough cloth, a kind of half-waking peace that needed no witness. On this particular night, the wind had grown sharper. It had teeth, though it didn't bite hard, just to nibble at the corners of the room. A reminder that outside these walls, the world was harder. It had no beds, no fire. Only stars like cracked silver and animals huddled together in burrows waiting for the sun to show mercy. Inside, they slept in layers, not just of fabric, but of time. Stories told earlier had softened their minds. Small memories of a better harvest, of a neighbor's wedding, layered like blankets over the chill. Even the quiet arguments about who fetched kindling were smoothed by the fire's slow hush. Everything, eventually, was forgiven in the warmth. The dog rose, circled twice, and settled again, pressing its back to the boy's legs. A barrier against the wind, a comfort that didn't need words.
Outside.
A loose shutter banged once, then twice, before going still. The wind had moved on, perhaps. Or grown bored. Or found someone else to bother. The thatch above them held. Mostly, a few drips tapped onto the stone floor in slow rhythm, like a child counting their own breath. But no one stirred. The rhythm was known. Old, as familiar as the creak of the roof beam or the scrape of a mouse pawing through forgotten crumbs. No one thought about mourning. Not yet. That was too far. It's too uncertain. Morning meant work and cold fingers and aching backs. But night asked nothing. It just allowed, cradled, like a lullaby with no melody. Like a song whispered by walls too old to stand, but too proud to fall. Even the fire had quieted. Its last breath curled up toward the smoke hole, vanishing into the dark like a sigh. The room was cooling. The frost would come in by morning. But for now, there was still warmth beneath the wool. Still life in the silence. You'd still one more hour to rest. And outside, the wind sang softly through the village, calling no one, touching everything, just passing through. The bed wasn't a bed the way we think of them now. It was straw, crushed, flattened, sometimes damp, layered over wooden slats or, more often, the bare dirt floor. The straw poked through in places, scratching ankles and catching in tunics. It smelled of harvest, of mice, of feet. But it was all they had, and so it became comfort. Above the straw, they built warmth the way others built walls, one layer at a time. First came linen, coarse and stiff, worn thin by years of washing, then wool, heavier, scratchier, but filled with the weight of survival. Cloaks were repurposed, sometimes still damp from a long day outside. And finally, whatever animal skin or stitched sack they could find. Some slept in shifts, not by choice, but because the blankets didn't reach. One would rise to tend the fire, and the next would slide into their place, claiming the lingering warmth. There was no such thing as personal space. Bodies pressed close, not for affection, but necessity. A child nestled between siblings. Grandmother's back curved to shield her youngest grandchild's feet. Wool was the most precious fabric in the house. Not silk, not cotton, just wool. Thick, scratchy, heavy with the scent of lanolin and smoke. A tunic passed from father to son was considered lucky if it still held heat. They mended it again and again until the patches told more stories than the threads. Stitch a memory, a moment, a winter survived. The feet were always cold. Always, no matter the layers, no matter the socks stuffed with dried grass. Cold found the toes first and stayed there. They rubbed their feet together beneath the blankets, creating tiny bursts of friction. The straw helped a little, so did shared breath beneath the wool. But still, the cold remained, like a guest who never left. When the wind howled through the eaves, the children pulled the blanket tighter, wrapping their heads until only noses peeked out. Some muttered half-remembered prayers, more habit than hope. Others clutched carved bits of wood, tokens passed from mothers who had nothing else to give. Sleep came slowly, like bread rising too far from the hearth. Sometimes they spoke before drifting off, not loudly, but enough to keep the dark company. A story about a fox in the hills. A riddle shared so many times it no longer needed an answer. Words carried warmth, the kind that lingered in the folds of the blanket even after the speaker had gone quiet. Silence, when it arrived, came gently. No pillow cushioned their heads, just rolled cloaks or bundles of hay wrapped in cloth. The smell of earth was everywhere, even in dreams. Rats scurried beneath the floor, and owls called from outside. But inside was still. Inside was sacred. A room shared by life and sleep and survival, all bound together under one patched quilt. They wore their clothes to bed. All of them. Layer after layer, even belts left on to keep tunics from riding up. Sometimes a child was tucked inside a parent's cloak, arms wrapped tight around a chest, still warm from the fire. It was not elegant. It was not soft. But it was enough. Enough to keep the night at bay. Warmth was never assumed. It was earned, maintained, chased. They pressed bricks to the hearth, wrapped them in cloth, and placed them at their feet. They carried coals and pots tucked under stools. They used every trick remembered from mothers and grandmothers before them. Each one passed down like magic, even though the magic never lasted long. Wool caps were worn indoors. Mittens were kept on hands long after the fire died. Fingers curled in on themselves, clutching at scraps of cloth like tiny lifelines. And still, the air bit at the edges, behind the knees, beneath the arms, where the cloth sagged. Cold always found a way in. In the far corner, a grandmother whispered something soft, something rhythmic, not quite a song. It was a lullaby with no melody, a phrase too old to trace. The children didn't need to understand the words. They knew the sound meant safety, that it meant sleep was near, that it meant someone else was still awake, keeping watch. Above them, the thatch roof held snow like a lid, heavy, silent, unmoving. Sometimes it creaked in the night, shifting under weight. They didn't fear it. The roof had survived storms, wind, even time. What mattered more was the warmth trapped beneath it. The bodies, the breath, the hush. The cold couldn't take that. It's not completely. They didn't dream of summer. Not in the deep of winter. Summer was too far, too foreign. Their dreams were smaller, of bread not gone stale, of shoes that fit, of waking to find the fire still alive. Hopes bundled as tightly as their blankets, fragile but steady. Dreams weren't for escaping. They were for remembering. A child shifted and muttered something, his hand reaching out into the dark. Another hand met it, held it, then slowly let go. No words exchanged, just warmth passed like a gift. These gestures were constant, quiet, repeated every night like prayers carved into wood. No one remembered when they started, only that they mattered. The fire in the hearth coughed softly, settling into its final embers. A faint red glow lit the outline of the room, the kettle hanging above the ashes. The stool by the wall, the rough shape of a broom leaning like an old man in a corner. The shadows didn't move. They were resting, too. Outside, the world had grown harder. The wind didn't sing anymore. It scraped. Trees bent without breaking, fields slept beneath frost. The village was silent, each home wrapped in its own quiet struggle. But within this one room, there was stillness. And in that stillness, warmth, fragile, faint, but real. The child exhaled, a soft puff of mist rising and disappearing. His fingers stilled. The breath evened. Sleep had come, not all at once, but gradually, like wool settling around the body or the dark folding in. And with it came peace, the kind no storm could steal. Even in the coldest nights, warmth was possible. Not through fire, but through closeness, through memory, through the quiet miracle of staying. The frost had thickened overnight, crawling up the inside of the oiled cloth windows like tiny white vines. The morning sun hadn't arrived, but its promise lingered somewhere beyond the hills, quiet and slow. Beneath the blankets, breath rose and faded like steam from a dying kettle. No one had stirred yet, not even the dog. The mother was the first to move, but only barely. Her hand reached out to check the edge of the fire pit, feeling the air above it, judging the warmth left behind. The ash was cold now, barely tinged with heat. She didn't rise. Not yet. Instead, she pulled the wool back over her shoulders and waited. Waking was not sudden. It was layered, like the sleep before it. A shift of feet, a tightening of arms, a slow inhale through cold nostrils, but is adjusted gradually, not in response to time, but to temperature. The day didn't begin because of clocks. It began because the warmth had begun to fade. The dog stretched a long creak of limbs and a soft puff of breath. It turned once, twice, then settled back beside the youngest child, its head resting gently across the boy's feet. Outside, a branch cracked under frost. Inside, the family still clung to the moment before motion, suspended in a kind of shared breath. The boy was dreaming of bread. Not just any bread, but a crusty heel, still warm with butter that didn't exist. In his dream, it was heavy in his hand, soft in the middle, real. He smiled in his sleep, just faintly. His hands twitched against the blanket, holding what wasn't there, believing it for a moment longer. The mother knew she had to move. The fire wouldn't rebuild itself. The kettle wouldn't boil. But still, she waited. She listened to the silence inside the room and let it wrap around her like one more layer of warmth. There was comfort in not rushing, even when the cold insisted otherwise. Eventually, she sat up slowly. The blanket slid down her back, releasing the stored warmth into the room. She reached for the pile of kindling stacked near the hearth damp, brittle, but enough. Her fingers moved with practiced quiet, avoiding the creaks in the floorboards, the loudness of waking too fast. The flint sparked once, then twice, and finally caught. A flicker, a pulse. Smoke rose first, curling up toward the roof beams where soot had painted the wood black over years of repetition. The flame was small, but alive. She cupped her hands around it, whispering nothing, just breathing it stronger. Light returned slowly, not from the outside, but from within. The fire lit the corners of the room in warm orange, painting shadows across familiar shapes. A pot, a basket, a boot turned sideways. These things did not change, but each morning they looked slightly different in the dawn fire glow. The father stirred next, not because of the fire, but because of the chill at his back. He rolled toward it, pulling the child along with him, like two logs shifting in the same stream. He didn't speak, just opened his eyes, blinked twice, and exhaled the long breath of a man waking to another day. He sat up, rubbed his chest, and reached for his boots. They were stiff with frost, the leather bent from use, the laces already half frozen. He didn't flinch. He didn't curse. He simply tapped them against the floor, coaxing them back to life, and pushed his feet inside one after the other. The kettle went on next, suspended above the fresh flame with a loop of iron and care. Inside, yesterday's water had frozen to a thin crust. She broke it with her finger and poured more from a clay jug, watching her breath rise with the steam. The children followed like echoes. First the boy, who murmured something and sat up with wild hair and closed eyes. Then the girl, still wrapped in a blanket, blinking through sleep, hands tucked beneath her chin. They said nothing. They didn't need to. The morning spoke loud enough. Steam curled from the kettle's spout, and the smell of wet straw, smoke, and boiled grain filled the room. It was not delicious, but it was familiar. It was enough. The mother stirred the pot with a wooden spoon worn thin from use. Every circle in the pot mirrored the rhythm of the day ahead. The food was simple porridge, thickened with barley or oats, maybe a scrap of root vegetable from last night's meal. Each bowl was filled slowly, carefully, without waste. No one complained. They ate with wooden spoons, huddled around the fire, steam rising from the bowls like prayers without words. A bird called outside, sharp and sudden. The sound carried over the rooftops and across the frozen fields. It was the same bird every morning, or at least it seemed that way. A blackbird, maybe, or a thrush. The children paused and listened, as they always did, waiting for the second call. When it came, the father stood. It was time. He didn't say so he didn't need to. The children handed him his gloves. The mother tied the scarf around his neck. Each movement practiced, reverent, like tending to a ritual. Then the door creaked open, letting the cold pour in like water. He stepped out into it, pulling the door closed behind him. The wind kissed his face with sharp fingers, the frost crunched beneath his boots, and the house behind him shrank to a glow. A soft, flickering box of warmth behind walls made of wattle, daub, and love. Inside, the mother turned to the girl. Her voice, still husky from sleep, murmured instructions. Gather the scraps, clean the bowls, stir the ashes. She spoke gently, her tone filled with something deeper than words. This was not a demand. It was a rhythm. One they danced every day. The girl obeyed, hands red from cold, but quick. She folded the blankets, swept the floor, chased away the dust that crept in with the morning air. Every task made the room more itself less a shelter and more a home. Each motion was a stitch in the fabric of their survival. The boy was quiet. He liked to sit near the fire, even after eating, legs pulled tight to his chest, eyes half closed. He watched the smoke curl into the air and imagined it carried stories, not words, just feelings. He breathed them in slowly, letting the warmth soak into his bones. Outside, the village had begun to stir slowly, like a body remembering how to move. Chimneys released their morning breath. Cows lowed softly behind fences. A rooster called once, and then again, as if to be sure. And the wind, though still cold, had lost its bite. The cottage stood, unchanged, crooked, small, but glowing. Within its walls, warmth was still being made. Not from firewood alone, but from hands, from habit, from the quiet work of staying warm, staying close, staying human. Let the day begin, gently, quietly, as it always had, as it always would. The father's footsteps disappeared down the path that curved along the edge of the fields. His silhouette grew smaller, swallowed by frost-covered hedges and the pale breath of morning fog. The air clung to his beard in lashes like glass dust. Every step was familiar, yet never easy. Mud beneath, sky above, and cold in every space between. The fields were quiet in winter. Nothing green, nothing soft. Just the brittle remains of last season's hope. He walked past rows of dead stalks that rustled without wind, stiff with ice. Each breath he took rose upward and broke apart, vanishing into the gray. The land made no promises in winter, only tests. Back inside the cottage, the girl finished sweeping the floor, the broom leaving shallow trails in the dust near the hearth. She paused by the wall where the morning light was strongest, watching it shift across the stone in slow, golden lines. Light like this didn't warm much, but it gave the illusion of warmth. That was often enough. The mother handed her a small bundle of cloth. Inside it, a wedge of hard cheese and a scrap of bread. It wasn't for now. It was for later, tucked into a satchel, a mid-morning gift. The girl smiled faintly and nodded. Nothing was said. The gift of food, even when small, was always received with gratitude, not words. The boy began to pull on his outer tunic, stiff near the sleeves, lined with fur around the collar. His fingers struggled with the fastening, clumsy from the cold. The mother came behind him and helped. She didn't speak either. Just buttoned the cloth with gentle fingers, then patted his shoulder and moved on. By midday, the sun had crept higher, but the cold didn't fade. It simply changed form, from icy bite to dry wind. The girl and boy walked toward the common well, carrying empty pails with twine-wrapped handles. Each step crunched beneath them. Every breath left white trails behind. Their boots rubbed blisters, but they kept walking. The well sat in the center of the village like a sentinel. Its stones were blackened from years of use, the wooden crank smooth where fingers had worn it. Other children were already there, stamping their feet and cupping hands to mouths. Everyone waited their turn. No one spoke unless necessary. Speech wasted heat. The girl lowered the bucket with practiced ease, listening to the long silence as it descended. When the splash finally echoed upward, it sounded too far away, like it belonged to another world. She cranked the rope slowly, muscles tight, shoulders hunched. The water was heavier in winter. Everything was heavier in winter. The boy helped carry it home, careful not to spill. His fingers turned pink around the handle, but he said nothing. One boy nearby had wool sewn around his mitts. Another wore 2 different boots. No one laughed. In winter, every odd solution was wisdom. Comfort was creativity, not fashion. Back at the cottage, the water was poured into a basin near the fire, steaming faintly. The mother used it to wash a cloth, then to wipe the floor near the hearth. Ash had drifted outward during the morning stirring, forming pale gray fans on the stone. She cleaned in silence, pausing now and then to press her hand near the flame. The girl joined her, and together they cleaned the surfaces that mattered. The table, the bench, the rim of the window where damp collected. Dust in winter didn't rise, but it settled everywhere. Each sweep of the rag made the room feel more awake, not brighter, just less forgotten. The dog scratched at the door and was let out briefly. It sniffed the air, barked once toward the trees, then returned, paws dusted white. The mother rubbed its ears with a folded cloth, checking for cuts or ice. She whispered something to it, a name maybe, then returned to stirring the pot that would be their supper. The stew was thin today. It's turnip, onion skin, and a few beans that had survived the frost. It simmered slowly, the scent mixing with smoke and wool. No one complained. Thin stew in winter was still warmth, still memory, still the taste of care. Later, the father returned. His boots thudded against the packed earth floor. He didn't smile, but he nodded once, and that was enough. He placed a small bundle on the table. Firewood dry. The room shifted with quiet relief. Firewood was better than coin in winter. It meant safety, sleep, a future. He removed his cloak, shook off the frost, and sat by the fire, hands outstretched. The children huddled near him. Not for stories, not for play, just to share the heat of a man who had been moving. His skin radiated what they lacked. They leaned against him like stones around a flame. The stew was served in the same bowls as breakfast, now rinsed clean with warm water. The spoons passed from hand to hand, and the steam filled the room again. It smelled slightly better now, more rooted, less raw. The boy exhaled loudly after the first sip. It was too hot, and that was perfect. After eating, the mother wiped each child's face with a warm cloth, one by one. It wasn't about cleanliness. It was about ritual, about caring for what little they could control. The cloth smelled faintly of lavender from a pouch tucked inside her apron. Small mercy, saved from summer. Outside, the last light was fading. Winter didn't wait long to return. The sky dimmed to pewter, the snow reflecting what little glow remained. Shadows thickened along the base of the trees. Doors across the village began to close. Curtains were drawn, lamps lit. The hush returned. Inside the cottage, the children began to stack their layers again. Tunics over undershirts, wool above wool. They prepared not for sleep, but for the approach of cold. Bedtime came early in winter, not from exhaustion, but because the fire could not be fed forever. They slept while the warmth lasted. The father placed more wood on the fire, carefully arranging it to catch without smoke. He watched the flames rise with a craftsman's eye, not proud but deliberate. He leaned back on his stool, knees wide, one hand resting on the worn handle of the iron poker. The fire was speaking again, and he was listening. The children crawled beneath the same patchwork blanket, limbs folding into one another. The girl rested her head against the boy's back. He muttered a question, but she was already half asleep. The mother tucked the edges in around their feet, pressing down gently, the way her mother had done for her. The dog lay across the door again, its body a barrier, a signal to the cold that it would not enter without effort. Its breath slowed, its eyes closed. The father and mother exchanged no words, just watched the flames shrink to orange threads and leaned slightly toward one another. The roof didn't leak tonight. That was a blessing. The air was sharp, but not cruel. A soft wind rustled the thatch, like someone walking above in heavy woolen socks. The fire popped once, then settled. The shadows curled inward. The walls stopped creaking. Nothing moved now except for breath. And in that breath, sleep returned, not as escape, but as a reward. The moon had risen without being noticed, casting silver light across the frozen yard beyond the door. Touched the tops of the woodpile, the edge of the trough, the rim of the roof. Ice glistened faintly where snow had melted and refrozen, creating smooth curves like glass. No one saw it. Inside, the shutters stayed closed, the world reduced to breath and warmth and hush. Beneath the blanket, the girl shifted in her sleep, not waking, but murmuring something inaudible. Her fingers curled toward her chest. The boy beside her adjusted his legs without knowing it, his heel brushing straw. Their limbs moved like leaves in a slow current, separate, but tethered. The blanket didn't rustle, simply adjusted, as if it too were dreaming. The mother had fallen asleep by the fire, her back against the stool, her shawl pulled loosely over her shoulders. Her breathing was even calm. One hand still rested in her lap, palm up, as if waiting to receive something. The fire lit her face from below, turning each line into a soft valley, every shadow gentle. She had not meant to sleep, but the warmth had asked her to stay. The father remained awake a while longer. He sat with his elbows on his knees, head bowed, watching the last of the flames fold inward. The coals were glowing now, red and slow, like embers buried in memory. He didn't speak, didn't think really. He just listened to the wood's final sigh, to the air's quiet stillness, to the slow rhythm of a house holding itself together. Sometimes he remembered his own boyhood bed, not so different from this one straw cold feet, a patchwork blanket shared with siblings. He remembered the sound of his father's boots, and the way the roof would drip water into a pot near the door during storms. That pot had rusted years ago. Still, in memory, it rang clear. Outside, the wind began to move again. Not strong, just present. It pushed through the village like an old guest returning, brushing against barn doors and chicken coops, lifting the edges of haystacks. It did not knock, it did not threaten. It simply reminded the land that it was still there, watching, breathing, waiting for morning. The fire gave one last crack, then settled into silence, The father stood slowly, knees stiff, and laid one more log across the top knot, to burn now, but to catch at first light. A small ritual, a quiet insurance against frost. He nudged the log into place with care, then turned and walked to his blanket. He lay beside his family, not touching them, but close. The blanket rose to cover his chest. He adjusted his shoulders, pulled his cap lower, and closed his eyes. The room grew smaller now, not in space, but in sound. Even the wind outside seemed to hush itself, as if in respect for the sleeping. Sleep in this house didn't come with dreams of joy or fantasy. It came as rest, as stillness, as a temporary forgetting. The world would return soon enough. Muddy boots, frozen buckets, aching backs. But for now, it could be left outside, beyond the wall, where the dogs stood guard, and the snow pressed in quietly. Somewhere down the lane, a rooster crowed too early, confused by the moonlight. No one stirred. The call drifted over rooftops and vanished into the dark. The dog opened one eye, waited, then lowered its head again. All was still. All was allowed to rest. The moonlight slipped through a crack in the shutter, landing on the girl's foot. It did not wake her. It simply settled there, a soft reminder of the world beyond the blanket. The straw beneath her shifted slightly with her breath. The wind paused, and the house exhaled. In the village, every house told the same story. Different faces, different hands, but the same slow ritual of surviving the night. Fires fed until they could no longer be. Blankets layered with more memory than thread. The knowledge passed down not through books, but through gesture, through shared sleep. Back in the cottage, a soft creak came from the roof beam. As the cold settled deeper, the noise was familiar, predictable. It spoke not of danger, but of time passing. The children did not wake. Their fingers twitched occasionally, touching dreams that would be forgotten by morning. Their lips moved but made no sound. The coals glowed beneath ash like buried fireflies. Their light danced faintly across the stones, catching the edge of the cooking pot. The curve of a stool leg, the line where the wall met the floor. These shapes were not important, but they mattered. In sleep, everything softened. No prayers were said aloud, but they lived in the silence. They lived in the way the mother had stirred the stew, in the way the father had laid the wood. In the blanket tucked just so around small feet, prayer in this place was a doing, not a saying. A quiet reply to the cold's constant question, "Will you last the night?" The answer always was yes, because they had to. Because warmth came not from fire alone, but from repetition, from presence, from every layer cloth. Memory cares, stitched together in the shape of a home that bent, leaned, creaked, but held. As the night deepened, even the wind grew weary. Its voice faded to a low hum, distant and soft, like someone humming through wool. Snow fell somewhere beyond the fields, too far to hear, too light to notice, but the air thickened slightly, heavy with the hush that only snowfall brings. Inside, the family slept. The girl's hand, still small, rested against the boy's back. The mother's chest rose and fell beneath her shawl. The father lay still, a breath away from waking. The fire, quiet now, dreamed in its ashes. The night did not end. It folded inward and waited for dawn. By the time the first dull gray light touched the thatched roof, the world outside had frozen into stillness. Icicles hung from the eaves like silent chimes, unmoving, untouched by breeze. The yard held no footprints yet, just a smooth crust of snow stretching out like untouched linen. Inside the cottage, no one stirred. Sleep lingered longer on mornings like this. The fire had gone cold again. Only a faint glow remained beneath a layer of ash, a soft pulse like something breathing its last. The room had chilled in the hours before sunrise. Even the walls seemed to draw inwards, holding their breath, but the bodies beneath the blanket stayed close, huddled together in shared warmth and silence. The mother awoke first, as always, her bones already aching before her eyes opened. She did not move immediately. Mind drifted through the quiet, listening for signs.
The soft wheeze of the boy's breath.
The occasional crack of the roof beam above. When she heard only calm, she sat up, pulling the shawl tight around her. She moved through the room as though the floor might shatter. Her feet knew every creak, every shift in the boards, every place where cold gathered like dust. She crouched by the hearth and stirred the ash with the end of a spoon. The coals sighed. Not dead, then, just resting. A small victory in the language of winter. With practiced hands, she placed a few thin twigs onto the embers, followed by dry kindling wrapped in twine. She leaned close and bloomed it hard, not fast, but steady. The coals responded slowly, almost shyly, a flicker here, a curl of smoke there. And then, finally, the orange bloom of fire returned. As flames found breath again, the room changed. Shadows slipped back into corners. Cold retreated a little. It's not enough to warm, not yet, but enough to shift the air from lifeless to living. She added a larger log, and it hissed where snow had melted into the bark. Steam rose, thin and white. The father stirred next. He didn't speak, didn't even open his eyes right away. He simply turned toward the warmth, his hands stretching slightly toward the fire. His back cracked faintly as he moved, and a deep sigh left his chest. He'd dreamt of water, or maybe the sea. But now, only wood smoke filled his lungs. He sat up slowly, wincing, and reached for his boots. They were stiff again. He knocked them against the floor with two dull thuds, then slid his feet in, wiggling his toes as the leather gave way. The girl stirred nearby, but didn't open her eyes. The warmth of the blanket was too strong, too stubborn. The boy rolled over in his sleep, pulling the edge of the quilt tighter. He mumbled something a name, maybe, or just a sound and nestled deeper into the straw. His feet found the dog's belly. The dog, already awake, didn't move. It blinked once, then closed its eyes again, content to be a cushion. The mother began preparing the morning meal. It would be small, as always. Boiled grain. Maybe a few shreds of dried apple from the cloth pouch she'd hidden months ago. She tapped the pot gently with the spoon, listening to the water pop and sizzle as it heated. The scent was faint, but comforting. As the fire grew, so did the light. It filtered through the cloth-covered window, pale and unsure, turning the inside of the room silver. Dust floated gently in its path. The girl opened her eyes and watched the way it moved lazy spirals, soft descents. She reached up and let one fleck land on her fingertip. The father stepped outside without his coat, just for a moment. The cold hit him like a wall, and he winced as the wind found the space between his collar and neck. The sky was heavy, low and colorless. Somewhere a crow cawed once, and then was silent. The world felt suspended, waiting for something. He returned quickly and shut the door behind him, stomping snow from his boots. His hands were already red from the cold. He held them out to the fire and grunted, then turned to his wife and nodded. She nodded back. No words needed. The day had begun. They would endure it, as they always had. The children sat up together now, bleary-eyed and quiet. The girl rubbed her arms through her sleeves, as the boy scratched his head and blinked at the pot. He could already taste the porridge in his mind, its warmth, its texture, its faint sweetness. He wouldn't say it out loud, but it made waking up easier. They ate in silence, save for the occasional scrape of a spoon. The sound was gentle, steady, almost rhythmic. No one rushed. The heat from the bowls warmed their faces. For a moment, they all leaned forward together, heads bowed over steam, like monks at morning prayer. There was something holy in the stillness. After breakfast, the girl fetched the broom. She swept the straw bedding gently, pushing aside the pieces that had clung to woolen sleeves and hair. The boy helped roll up the corners of the quilt, folding them with care. The dog stretched, then padded over to sit by the door, watching them with solemn eyes. The father pulled on his coat, heavier now with the extra patch sewn at the elbow. He took a bundle of rope and a sack from the wall. The mother handed him a small strip of salted meat wrapped in cloth. He tucked it into his pocket and kissed her forehead without a word. Then he left again. Today, he would walk to the edge of the woods, looking for fallen limbs to cut. Not to sell, just to burn. Dead branches still held life in winter if you knew where to find it. He would look for dry bark, light wood, the kind that cracked loud when stepped on. His eyes were trained to see fire in trees. Inside, the girl sat near the hearth and began to mend a tear in the hem of her tunic. Her fingers worked the needle carefully, lips pressed together in concentration. The thread was rough and too light, but it would hold. The boy practiced his letters with a stick in the ash. He didn't know what they meant, only that they were part of something bigger. The wind picked up again, rattling the shutter just once before moving on. The fire flared slightly, then settled. The room remained steady. Small tasks continued. The stew pot was washed. The water basin emptied and filled again. The blanket folded for evening use. Each motion slow, soft, necessary. As the day stretched on, the sun barely climbed. Its light never turned gold, only gray. But inside the home, time passed gently, not in minutes or hours, but in tasks completed, in warmth restored, in the fire holding. And though the cold scratched at the walls, it did not enter. Not today, not yet. The woods had not changed. Bare trees stood like skeletal towers, their branches sharp against the sky. Snow clung to the bark in places, the ground beneath crunched underfoot, uneven and littered with the memory of autumn. The father moved slowly, each breath leaving his mouth in clouds, his eyes scanning the tree line. He knew where the fallen branches liked to hide. He carried a dull axe at his side, tied with leather. It wasn't sharp, but it was trusted. His boots sank in patches where the snow had softened, then crunched again where ice had formed. The wind here was louder, unbroken by walls or fire. It moved around him like a spirit, pulling at his coat, whispering between the trees. Every few paces, he bent to pick up a branch, testing it for weight, for dryness, for sound. If it cracked, it was good. If it bent, he left it. His hands wrapped in cloth, moved with care. The cold made the fingers stiff, but the work kept them from freezing. He never paused for long. Movement was warmth. The woods were quiet, not dead, but resting. Birds flitted from branch to branch in silence. Somewhere deeper in, a deer watched him pass, unseen. He didn't need the animals, not today. He only needed wood, enough to feed the fire tonight, maybe tomorrow. He counted every piece as he tied them together with twine. Back in the village, the sun reached its highest point, but gave no warmth. The girl sat outside, mending a hole in a sack by the doorway, her fingers moving quickly, breath fogging with every exhale. The boy sat beside her, working a stick into the packed earth, carving lazy circles. The dog lay between them, tail twitching with sleep. The mother stood inside by the hearth, pouring the cooled water from the kettle into a jug. She set it near the door for the next task. The fire had grown steady again, its glow reaching the edges of the floor. It spoke in soft cracks and warm sighs, anchoring the room in rhythm. In winter, fire was the clock. She moved with purpose, cleaning bowls, folding cloth, sweeping near the wall where ash collected. Her mind was always partially elsewhere, on the stew to come, the wood supply, the ache behind her knees, but her hands knew what to do. They had done it for years. They would continue for years more. The girl stood and carried the finished sack inside, placing it neatly by the shelf. Her face was red from the cold, but her eyes were clear. She took a piece of root from the basket and began shaving it down for the evening pot. Each motion small, deliberate. There was no rush. Rushing made hands slip. The boy came in next, rubbing his hands together, then holding them near the fire. He said nothing, just stood quietly until his skin warmed again. His cheeks puffed with each breath. The mother handed him a cloth to dry his fingers. He took it without a word, eyes never leaving the flame. Time passed unnoticed, not in hours, but in actions. A knock of wood, a turning of logs, a tightening of string. Each task completed was a stone added to the wall of survival, built slowly, silently, but it held strong, even when no one praised it, especially then. By late afternoon, the father returned, dragging the bundle of wood across the yard. His coat was dusted white. His eyes squinted from wind and light. He dropped the bundle by the door with a grunt, then bent to shake the snow from his sleeves. Inside, the dog barked once, then wagged its tail low and slow. He entered the cottage and was met with warmth. Not enough to melt the snow on his boots, but enough to breathe easier. He set the wood beside the hearth, then sat near it, hands open, letting the fire find him. His body steamed lightly. The mother brought him a cup of water, drank it in 3 long sips. The children hovered nearby, watching him without speaking. He glanced at them, nodded, and then looked back at the fire. His silence wasn't stern, it was full. The kind of quiet that comes from long walks in cold woods and the relief of flame. The kind of quiet that didn't need breaking. The stew pot was filled again. Onions, roots, a bit of salt. It simmered slowly, filling the cottage with a smell both sharp and sweet. The girl stirred it gently, careful not to let anything stick. The boy set the table, just wooden bowls and a cloth. The dog circled once, then lay down again. Darkness returned early. The light drained from the sky as if wrung out, leaving only a thin blue behind the trees. The window shutter was pulled tight. The door was barred. Inside, the fire glowed bright now, its crackles soft but steady. The stew bubbled, the air warmed, and the world outside was forgotten. They sat to eat, knees close, elbows bumping. Food was hot, the portions small but filling. Each spoonful warmed their bellies, reaching fingers and toes. No one spoke. It's not because there was nothing to say, but because there was nothing to complain about. The food was good. The fire was strong. They had enough. After the bowls were cleaned, the father reached for the firewood and stacked a few more pieces. The dog yawned, long and slow, and shifted closer. The boy lay down first, followed by the girl who brought the blanket with her. The mother tucked them both in, brushing back a lock of hair, patting the edge into place. The father remained near the fire. The mother joined him, and they sat in silence for a while, their hands resting on their laps. Occasionally, the wood shifted in the fire, a log cracked. Sparks rose. The dog sighed. These were the only sounds, and they were enough. Eventually, the parents lay down too, joining the warm bundle of limbs and fabric and breath. The blanket rose and fell with each shared breath. The wind outside had quieted. The roof held strong. The fire burned low but steady. Another day had been lived, another night prepared for. Sleep returned slowly. Not rushed, not fought, just accepted. Like snow on the thatch, like breath in the air, like warmth found where none should be. Sleep did not ask questions here. It simply arrived and stayed. The quiet wrapped itself around the room like another layer of wool, soft and unseen. Outside, the snow thickened in the dark, falling in gentle sheets over the roof, the path, the fence posts buried deep in white. No sound rose from the village. The world was holding still. Even the wind, so insistent by day, had forgotten to breathe. Inside, the fire pulsed in slow orange waves, casting dim light on the cracked walls and uneven floor. A kettle hung above it, half filled with water, gently rocking when the logs shifted. The air was warmer now, heavy with the smell of smoke and stew, and laced with the clean scent of snow drifting through unseen cracks. Nothing moved. Nothing dared. The boy was the first to stir, not waking, just drifting at the edge. He shifted beneath the blanket, legs curling tighter, arms folding in. His head pressed softly into the straw, where a corner had poked through the linen. He dreamed of walking behind his father through the trees, stepping into his footprints, matching his stride without words. The girl lay still beside him, her face barely visible in the dim glow. Her breath rose in quiet rhythm, even and slow. One arm was tucked beneath her head, the other curled near her chest, hand closed around nothing. She looked peaceful, as if the cold had never touched her, as if the wind had never found its way in. The mother slept lightly, her body curled toward the children, one hand resting on the quilt just above their feet. She wore her shawl even now, wrapped tight around her shoulders, the edges tucked beneath her chin. Her dreams were not clear, not vivid, just flickers of memory stitched together by habit and hope. The father lay on the far edge, one knee raised beneath the blanket, his face turned toward the wall. His breathing was deeper, more rugged, as if even in rest, his body held on to labor. His hand twitched once, a brief flicker of tension, and then relaxed again. Outside the door, the dog kept its silent post, curled like a loop of rope. The cottage seemed smaller in sleep, its corners pulled inward by shadow and silence. The firelight painted soft lines across the walls, catching on the edge of the broom, the shape of the bench, the rim of the wooden bucket. These were the same sights each night, but in this quiet hour, they became sacred, Above them, the thatch groaned gently as the snow settled further. One flake at a time, the roof gathered weight. The sound of it lost in the hush. No one heard. No one stirred. The home, worn and crooked, held fast. It had done so for winters long before this one. It would try to hold again. In the village, every home mirrored the same hush, rooms full of breath, fire, and bone. There were no songs sung in the dark, no footsteps. Only the sound of wood giving up its last heat and snow, nestling against shuttered windows. Even the animals had surrendered to stillness. In his sleep, the boy smiled briefly. His dream had changed. It was no longer in the woods. It was back at the table, bread in hand, butter on his thumb. Warmth spread from his chest to his cheeks, even though the room was cool. In his dream, he was full and safe. The fire shifted again, a single log settling, sending up a faint spark that drifted like a moth and vanished before reaching the beam above. The glow faded slightly, but the coals still held their heat. This was how fires died, not with a roar, but with a sigh. And still, the room remained warm. A mouse scurried beneath the floorboards, its tiny feet clicking softly against the wood. Sniffed the air, then vanished into the dark. No one noticed. Oh, the cottage allowed such small visitors, especially in winter. Life, in any form, was not unwelcome. Hunger made even the smallest movement sacred. The girl turned in her sleep, one leg shifting across the straw, her hand brushing the blanket's edge. Her breath caught briefly, then steadied. The mother, still asleep, moved a little closer, sensing the change. It was not conscious, not decided, just instinct, like a flame leaning toward air. The dog let out a low, muffled bark in its sleep, then stretched its legs and went still again.
Ow.
Its ears twitched once. Outside, snow piled quietly against the door, layering like dust across the threshold. If footsteps had passed, they left no trace. Nothing dared to disturb the night's embrace. The boy whispered something, just a sound, not a word. His lips parted, then closed again. His sister didn't hear. The fire gave one last glow, soft and thin. Then the room dipped gently into darkness. Not full, not deep, but quiet. A kind of candlelit shadow that asked for nothing and promised only pause. And still, the cottage held. It held the weight of snow, the chill of air, the hush of dreams, the warmth of presence. Sleep continued, slow and wide, like a frozen river beneath stars unseen. No fear, no rush. Just the steady rhythm of survival, softened by blankets and silence. Morning would come again, with frost on the boots and smoke in the sky. But not yet. For now, there was only stillness. Stillness and the soft murmur of breath. Stillness and the creak of old wood. Stillness and the fire waiting to be born again. Morning didn't arrive with color. Came quietly, the dark fading into something softer, something less certain. The snow outside had stopped, but its weight remained. It lay on rooftops and trees, clinging to fences and pressing into paths. There were no footsteps yet, no sounds. Just a world wrapped in pale silence. Inside the cottage, the air had cooled again. Fire was ash now, the coals faint and still. Breath showed in the air, curling up above each sleeper like soft mist. But no one moved. The warmth beneath the blanket held, bodies pressed close. Hands curled in, sleep stretched itself just a little longer. The dog was the first to wake, its ears twitching as it lifted its head. It sniffed once toward the door, then yawned, teeth flashing in the half-light. Snow pressed against the threshold, sealing out the cold. The dog shifted its weight and lay down again, eyes open now, watching the stillness breathe. The mother stirred next, her eyes opening with a slow blink. She didn't lift her head. Instead, she watched the faint light touch the wall, sliding across the wood like a promise. The cold had returned to her knees, to her knuckles, to the space behind her neck. But she didn't move yet. Not yet. She listened first. The boy's breath, the girl's fingers twitching slightly, the father's deep exhale. Nothing was wrong, and nothing was needed. But the day would call soon, and it was better to answer slowly. She sat up, rubbing her hands together, then tucked the shawl tighter around her shoulders. The fire had gone cold. She knelt beside it, pushing aside ash to find what might still glow. There was nothing. Only gray dust, soft and silent. She reached for the basket and chose the smallest twigs, arranging them like a story she'd told 1,000 times. Then she struck the flint. The spark danced once, then vanished. Again, she struck. This time it caught. Flicker became a thread, and a thread became a flame. She leaned close, feeding it slowly. Her breath helped shape it, guide it, protect it. In a few minutes, the fire was reborn. Not roaring, not strong, but alive. The warmth returned inch by inch. The shadows on the walls changed shape, grew deeper, more golden. The girl rolled onto her back and blinked at the ceiling. Her lips parted in a small yawn. Her hands reached up to stretch, but she didn't rise. She watched the smoke curl upward, soft and slow. The boy was curled tightly still, his legs drawn close, his face pressed into the fold of the blanket. He looked younger in sleep, softer. When he finally stirred, it was with a grunt and a squint toward the fire. Then he burrowed deeper for a moment, not ready yet to meet the cold. The father remained still, one arm draped across his chest, the other resting over the edge of the bed. He would wake when needed. He always did. For now, the warmth was enough to keep him where he was, caught between rest and readiness. The kind of pause only found before the first step of the day. The mother ladled water into the kettle and placed it above the flames. It hissed gently, steam rising in pale ribbons. She added herbs, not for flavor, but for comfort. Dried nettle, a pinch of crushed mint. The scent filled the space quickly, sharper than the smoke, softer than the snow. The girl finally sat up and wrapped the blanket around her shoulders like a cape. She padded barefoot to the fire, knees bent against the cold floor, and crouched beside her mother. No words passed between them, just presence, the kind that needed nothing else to be understood. The boy came next, his hair wild, his face flushed from sleep. He sat cross-legged on the straw and blinked at the fire. He reached his hands forward and held them there, letting the heat gather in his fingers, then fold into his chest. He didn't speak either. The silence was still sacred. They shared the tea in wooden cups, sipping slowly. The warmth moved down their throats and settled low in their bellies. It wasn't sweet. It wasn't rich. But it was warmth. And in the hush of winter, that was more than enough. The girl blew gently on her cup, watching the steam spiral into nothing. The father rose at last, stretching his arms and arching his back with a low groan. He stood near the wall and rolled his shoulders once, twice, then reached for his coat. A patch had come loose. He held it between his fingers, then looked toward the girl. She nodded. She would fix it. He stepped outside, boots crunching against the frozen path. The air was sharper now, brighter. The sky above had turned pale blue, the snow below reflecting it like a second sky. The trees stood heavy and quiet. Smoke curled from a few chimneys in the distance, thin gray lines against the cold. He walked toward the woodpile first, brushing snow from the top, checking the logs for dryness. Then he turned toward the animals. The small shelter near the fence, where the hens and goat waited. Their breath was visible, their movement slow. He fed them without words, his presence enough to calm them. Back inside, the mother prepared the morning mash. Oats, water, and what was left of the dried berries. It cooked slowly, thickening with time, filling the cottage with its warm scent. The children set out the bowls. The dog circled the hearth and lay down again, content with the morning rhythm. When the father returned, he stamped the snow from his boots and took a seat near the fire. His hands were red, knuckles chapped. He rubbed them together briefly, then took the bowl offered to him. Steam rose, brushing against his face like smoke from a memory. He ate slowly, eyes half closed. No one spoke during the meal. They didn't need to. The fire crackled. The spoon scraped. A log shifted and sent a small cascade of sparks up the chimney. Outside, the snow remained untouched. Inside, the day had begun. Not loudly, not quickly, but with care. After eating, the girl retrieved the sewing kit and began to mend the father's coat. Her stitches were uneven, but firm. The boy brought wood from the pile and stacked it by the door. The mother swept near the walls, collecting dust and ash into a neat line. The father sat quietly, watching the window. The wind had not returned. The silence outside matched the silence within. The house, though worn and narrow, stood strong. Its walls, lined with straw and memory, held the warmth like a secret. And beneath its roof, life continued, slowly, softly, held together by fire, fabric, and the quiet courage of habit. The sun never quite arrived that day. It lingered behind the clouds like a shy guest, casting only a weak gray light that never touched the corners of the village. The snow remained unbroken, blanketing everything in silence, flattening the world into stillness. Nothing sparkled, nothing gleamed. It was a light made of ash. The girl tied off the last stitch on the coat, biting the thread and tucking the needle into a scrap of cloth. She folded the coat carefully, smoothing the repaired patch with her palm. It wasn't perfect, a little crooked, the thread slightly too light, but it would hold. That was what mattered most in winter. Things that held. The boy, now finished stacking the firewood, knelt near the hearth again. He poked at the logs with a stick, watching them shift and spark. A few embers scattered, dim and brief, like red insects fleeing the heat. "Read," he smiled slightly. Not at the fire, but at the small power of moving it.
Aye, fire.
Was the only thing he could shape. The mother had started soaking the morning bowls. She wiped the insides clean with a damp cloth, setting them near the window where light might dry them. Her hands were pink from cold, fingers raw, but she didn't complain. Shh. She hummed softly instead, low and wordless, a tune with no name passed down by memory. The father stood and stretched again, rubbing the back of his neck. He moved to the door and opened it just enough to look outside. The snow had fallen heavier than he expected. He watched it for a moment, the blankness, the weight, then pulled his coat on and stepped out without speaking. He walked toward the fence, the one that leaned slightly near the eastern field. The snow reached halfway up the posts, hiding the lower rails. He brushed a section clear with his glove, inspecting the wood for rot. He shook his head. Not yet broken, but getting there. Spring, he would fix it. As he returned, he paused by the woodpile, brushing snow from his shoulders. The trees beyond the cottage stood like statues, their branches stiff with frost. There were tracks near the tree line. Animal, not man. Too light to be dogs. Probably a hare. He didn't follow them. The snow would cover them soon. Inside, the children had begun a game with stones. Small, smooth pieces collected in warmer months. They slid them across the floor, trying to land in a square scratched into the wood. The rules were simple, the laughter rare, but it came brief and soft, like wind through wool. The mother didn't stop them. She finished the washing and hung the cloths on a line near the fire. They dripped faintly, the water darkening the wood beneath. The steam rose and curled in lazy spirals, blending with the smoke from the hearth. The cottage smelled now of damp linen, ash. The dog, once asleep, rose and padded to the door, tail wagging faintly. It scratched once. The mother opened it slightly and let it out, then quickly closed it again to keep the heat in. The dog disappeared into the white, a soft blur against the snow, silent in its steps, nose to the ground. The father returned, stamping snow from his boots, his beard lined with frost. He took a seat beside the fire and watched the children's game for a few moments. Then, without a word, he reached for one of the stones and flicked it across the floor. It landed in the center square. The boy grinned wide. It wasn't often he played, but today the snow was too thick for work. The fields were hidden, the paths too slippery. There was nothing to fix, nothing to fetch. The day had become one of waiting, of stillness, of keeping warm and watching the world sleep. He could afford a moment of play. The girl leaned her head. Against his shoulder, he didn't move. He didn't speak. But he reached over and rested his hand on hers. It stayed there for a long time, even after the game had ended, even after the boy had wandered to the fire again. Some warmth didn't come from firewood. By afternoon, the clouds thickened again. The light began to dim, though the sun had never shone. Shadows returned to the corners of the room. The mother added more logs to the fire, stirring the embers, until flames rose again. The stew pot was set back on its hook, filled with barley and chopped roots. The smell filled the cottage slowly. mixing with the comfort of smoke and the sharpness of wet wool. The children settled onto the floor, listening to the stew bubble. No one asked when it would be ready. The answer was always the same. When it's soft enough to eat without teeth, the father took the mended coat and pulled it on. He nodded. Once to the girl, she smiled back. He looked out the window, but the snow was too thick now to see far. The trees were disappearing into the white, like ghosts stepping backward into silence. The world was shrinking again. Evening crept in early. The girl set out the bowls again, wiping them clean with a dry cloth. The boy fetched the spoons. The fire snapped once as a wet log hissed, but it stayed strong. The mother stirred the stew. With slow circles, the room felt smaller, closer, held together by heat and habit. They ate slowly, each spoonful warm and thick. The stew stuck to their ribs, left their lips slick with oil. The boy closed his eyes after each bite. The girl blew gently on her spoon. The father chewed with quiet patience. The mother didn't eat until the others had finished. She always waited. After the meal, the bowls were rinsed, the pot cleaned, and the girl brushed crumbs from the table. With the edge of her sleeve, the boy yawned and lay near the fire, arms tucked beneath his chest. The dog returned from outside, paws wet, belly damp with snow, shook once, then lay at the door again. The light faded until only the fire remained. The windows glowed faintly, the shutters shut tight against the dark. The father placed a final log on the fire. The mother pulled the blanket from the hook and spread it across the straw bed. The children slid beneath it without a word. The father joined them next, followed by the mother. The blanket was pulled tight, the edges tucked in, the fire dimmed. Slowly, the logs settling into embers. Outside, snow fell again, softer now, like dust being lowered by careful hands. The cottage was still. The village was still. Even the wind had grown tired. Sleep returned without being summoned. It drifted in like smoke, curling into corners, settling over limbs. It did not rush. It asked no questions. It came because it was safe to come. Because the day had been lived. Because the fire had burned. Because warmth had been kept even when it was hard to find. And so the night began again, not with noise, not with light, but with breath and silence. In the memory of hands that made it all possible, the fire hummed in low tones a lullaby. Of ember and crackle, as the last log settled into the ash, its glow bathed the room in orange pulses, dim and rhythmic, like the breath of something alive but weary. The shadows it cast were soft-edged and familiar, sliding over walls and coats. Dipping into the creases of worn stone and straw, everything in the room had shape, but no sharpness, just warmth. Just stillness. The family had gone quiet again, eyes closed, bodies curved like spoons into the curve of one another. They didn't speak, didn't whisper. There was no need. The words between them had already been spoken in the stirring of stew and the careful stitching of a coat and the way the fire was fed without asking.
Out in winter.
Love was action. Small, consistent, and entirely without applause. The boy let out a long breath in his sleep, soft and steady, curling his toes beneath the fold of the blanket. His hands were tucked beneath his chin, fingers twitching slightly with dream. It was warm now, deeply so, the kind of warmth that takes hours to build and seconds to lose. His cheeks were flushed, not with fever, with fire, with rest, with safety. Beside him, the girl slept with her back to the room, her face turned toward the wall where candlelight used to dance in summer months. Her hair spread across the shared straw like a spilled handful of thread. Her breath moved in, quiet gusts like wind across wheat. She held the corner of the blanket between her fingers, as though it were a thread to tether her. Sleep. The mother was the only one not fully asleep. Her eyes were closed, but her mind was adrift, not worrying, just drifting. She listened to the fire's soft groan, the dog's slow snore, the occasional shift of weight beside her. Her hand rested against the father's wrist, a habit of contact, an anchor in the night. She didn't dream yet. She waited. The father lay still, his chest rising and falling beneath the blanket's gentle weight. His face, often drawn with labor, looked soft in firelight, the sharp lines smoothed by the hush of sleep. His hands were rough, even in rest. Resting near his chest, calloused and curled, shaped by tools and years, he did not stir. His body knew this warmth well. Above them, the roof creaked lightly, not from storm or wind, but from snow shifting as the cottage breathed. The thatch held firm, its weight bowed slightly under the sky's cold offering.
Outside, flakes still.
Fell, soundless, steady, like dust from a forgotten sky. They layered across the path, the woodpile, the fence, erasing shape, replacing memory. No one in the village stirred. Doors remained closed, chimneys smoked faintly. Some windows glowed dim as stars, but most homes had surrendered to night. Winter did not invite long conversations. It asked only for quiet, for fire, for waiting. And the villagers obeyed, not from fear, but from wisdom. Inside the cottage, the heat began to shift, not fade, just redistribute. The fire, now mostly coal, gave off a deeper warmth, not sharp, not bright, but thick and slow, like the breath of a sleeping animal. The dog stretched once near the door, then rolled onto its side with a low sigh. Its tail flicked against the wood. The coals hissed as a knot of sap cracked in the center of the fire.
Ow.
A small plume of smoke curled upward, then vanished. Rose like fireflies caught in a jar, brief and golden. No one saw them, but they danced just the same, burning out before they reached the soot-blackened ceiling beam. The girl shifted in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible, then went still again. Her foot touched the boy's ankle. He didn't wake. His leg twitched once in reply, as if remembering her from within the dream. That's how sleep was in winter, shared, not spoken. Woven between breaths and movements that meant everything, even in silence. The blanket held tight around their shoulders. The corners had been tucked well, stitched by a grandmother long gone, whose fingers still lived in the seams. The fabric was worn smooth in places, the edges frayed, but the warmth had never left it. Each fiber held the memory of 100 nights like this one, quiet heirloom. The fire dimmed again, barely glowing now, just the heart of it still pulsing. It would need tending before morning, but not yet. There was still enough heat to carry them through the hours ahead. And if it faltered, there were arms and hands and bodies to share the warmth. The fire was a tool. The family, the true hearth. The mother drifted finally, her hand slipping from the father's wrist to rest near her chest. Her breathing matched his now, two slow rhythms joining in sleep. The wind outside sighed against the wall, not in anger, but in longing. The room held them like a breath held between words. The stone, the straw, the fire, the walls, all part of the same long story. One written not in ink, but in repetition, in touch. In the small victories of surviving another cold night. The story of a family who had only each other and found it enough, and so as the last coal faded to black, the snow whispered its last descent. The wind moved on, and the night deepened. Stillness held. By the time the first gray stretch of morning edged along the eastern sky, the snow had stopped falling. It had blanketed everything in silence, smoothing out the footprints, softening the fence posts, and turning the entire village into a page without writing. The cold remained, deep and slow, but it no longer pressed like a threat, simply lingered, like something old and patient. The cottage roof bore the weight without complaint. Ice clung to the eaves in thick, jagged blades, catching the first dull light. Inside, the fire had reduced to little more than a quiet glow tucked beneath gray ash. Still warm, still waiting. The heat it gave off was barely enough to reach the walls, but it reached the family, and that was enough. The mother opened her eyes to the cold first, not startled but steady, the way she always did. Her body responded before her thoughts. One hand reached to her knees, the other to the shawl. She sat up slowly, unwrapping herself from the blanket with care. Her breath came out in small clouds as she stood barefoot on the cold floor. She moved to the hearth and knelt again. The same motion every morning. She stirred the ash with the spoon, looking for the warmest point, the faintest glow. There it was, a soft orange heart, deep and small. She placed a curl of birch bark beside it and blew gently, coaxing the ember to remember its purpose. The flame came back without protest, like something returning from a long walk. It took the kindling with it, rose in soft spirals, and lit the room again in amber rhythm. The shadows slipped away from the corners. The air warmed near the floor. The dog opened one eye, then rested its head back down with a sigh. The father didn't wake yet, but his hand twitched once beneath the blanket. He would be up soon. Cold always found his back before it found anyone else. The children remained still, not from sleep, but from comfort. Their faces buried into the quilt, breath rising slow and even, their limbs barely moving under the woven weight. The mother added water to the kettle and hung it back over the fire. Watching the flames wrap around the pot's belly, she rubbed her hands together, then stood and moved to the window, lifting the shutter slightly. A band of snow tumbled inward onto the sill. She brushed it away and peered out into the white. The village looked like a place untouched by time. The roofs were rounded under thick snow, chimneys smoking quietly into a pale sky. No one walked yet. No animals called. The world was still deciding whether to wake. She let the shutter fall again and returned to the hearth, the fire brighter. Now beckoning, she began cutting dried root into a wooden bowl, her knife small and dull, but practiced. Each slice fell with a soft sound, the rhythm as familiar as her breath. The scent of the root released into the air, bitter, earthy, something between winter and memory. It would go into the morning mash, just enough to flavor the blandness. The father woke next, sitting up with a grunt and running a hand over his beard. He didn't speak. He stretched his arms, rolled his neck, and moved to the fire with slow steps. He crouched beside it, palms open to the flame. His eyes closed briefly. There was no need to rush. The world would wait. The girl opened her eyes next, blinking at the ceiling, her face half hidden by her hair. She shifted beneath the blanket, sat up slowly, and rubbed her shoulder where the straw had poked through the cloth. She didn't speak, either. Instead, she watched the fire for a while, arms wrapped tight around her knees. The boy came last, blinking at the light, mouth dry from sleep. He coughed once into the crook of his arm, then rubbed his eyes with both hands. His voice didn't come yet. He only nodded when the mother handed him a cup. It was warm water with a bit of honey stirred in. A kindness saved for deep winter. They didn't speak much in the morning. It wasn't silence from weariness. It was reverence. These hours were gentle. It belonged to warmth, to light, to the slow return of motion. The mother stirred the pot. The father fed the fire. The girl folded the corner of the blanket, where the edge had frayed. The boy watched steam rise. The dog scratched at the door. The mother let it out without a word, then quickly closed the door behind it, keeping the cold from slipping in too far. The kettle began to whistle faintly. The fire cracked louder now, flames licking higher as the dry wood caught in full. The room breathed easier. They ate with spoons and thick slices of bread left from yesterday's meal. The mash was hot, plain, but filling. They cupped their bowls close, letting the heat rise to their cheeks. The girl chewed slowly, staring into the flame. The boy swung his legs under the table, his toes brushing the stone floor with each swing. Outside, the first sounds began. A rooster in the far field. A door creaking open somewhere down the lane. Sled being pulled across frozen ground, the wood dragging in a rhythmic thump. Morning had arrived for the rest of the world, but inside the cottage, there was no rush to meet it. The father stood and pulled on his boots, tied with scraps of cloth where the leather had cracked. He slung his coat over his shoulder and took a small satchel from the wall. The girl handed him a scrap of cheese wrapped in cloth. He tucked it into his coat and gave a small nod. Then he stepped out into the white. His footprints vanished behind him as he walked, filled in almost instantly by the fine powder of the snow. His figure faded into the stillness. The mother watched through the shutter until he was gone, then returned to the fire. The children had begun gathering the bowls. The day's rhythm had begun again. The girl swept near the door. The boy folded the blanket, careful not to catch the corners on the straw. The mother ladled out the last of the mash into a pot for her. Later, the steam rose like a thread of warmth, disappearing into the roof beams. Outside, the sky remained pale, waiting, and the cottage, crooked, old, and full, remained the same. A shelter of stone and silence, where fire and breath wove together in slow circles. The snow might fall again, the cold might press harder, but inside the warmth was alive, kept not by wood alone, but by hands, by habit, by the quiet choosing. To stay, the day moved slowly, as most winter days did, without drama or noise, only the repetition of things already known. The girl folded cloths by the hearth, laying each one with care, smoothing wrinkles that would return as soon as the cold found them again. Her breath fogged slightly in the air, even with the fire warm behind her. Wind outside pressed against the walls like a memory trying to come in. The boy had found a stick by the fire, half burned, and used it to draw in the layer of ash that coated the floor's edge. He wasn't drawing pictures, just lines, loops, patterns without meaning. It was a way to pass time, to move without working, to feel the morning stretch without weight. The soot clung to his fingertips, soft and gray. The mother sat at the table now, mending a tear in the lining of a glove. Her needle moved slowly, rising and falling like a breath. The thread was coarse and frayed at the end, but it still held. Everything they owned held on longer than it should. That was the way of it. Things were kept until they couldn't be kept anymore. The fire, no longer roaring, had settled into a deep, golden rhythm. It didn't shout, it hummed, logs hissed, softly as their cores surrendered to the heat, sending up small pops like whispered punctuation. The flames leaned gently against the blackened pot, which hung above the embers. Full now with water for cleaning, not for tea. From outside came the slow creak of a sled. Sound moved across the snow in a broken rhythm, as if the rope tugging. It pulled unevenly. The girl paused in her folding to listen. The boy stood near the shutter, one hand on the frame. Neither of them spoke. They just waited for the sound to pass. The sled belonged to the baker, they guessed. He came twice a week from the far edge of the village, delivering rough loaves wrapped in cloth. Sometimes, if the snow wasn't too deep, he let the children near the lane toss feed to his mule. But not today. The cold was too bitter, and the mule moved quickly. The dog barked once from the yard, then again louder. The boy opened the door just enough to let it slip in, its fur coated with a fine crust of frost. It shook once, snow flying in small bursts. Across the floor, and it padded straight to the fire, circled twice, and collapsed beside the girl's foot. The mother didn't look up from her sewing. She only murmured, "Dry its paws," and the girl reached for the cloth without protest. She wrapped the dog's feet one at a time, wiping away the cold and pressing warmth back into them. Ow. Dog licked her wrist when she finished, then lay still again, tail thumping once. Outside, the light didn't change much. It remained pale, a wide sheet of dull gray that pressed against the village like a second roof.
Ow.
The trees stood like statues in the distance. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin, twisting columns that disappeared into the sky without ever thickening. Even the birds had gone quiet. The boy gathered kindling in a basket, moving slowly so the twigs didn't rattle too much. He placed them beside the hearth with deliberate care, then returned to sit cross-legged near the fire. He watched the coals now, not because he had to, but because they moved in a way nothing else did alive, but not busy. The mother tied off the final stitch and held the glove up to the light, inspecting the seam with narrowed eyes. It wasn't perfect, but it was good enough. She placed it in a pile with the other winter things, stacked neatly beneath the bench. The pile smelled of wood smoke and wool and the faintest trace of earth. The girl started peeling roots for the stew. Her hands were quick, the knife steady. The peels fell in long curls onto a cloth, the pale flesh beneath bright against the dim of the room. Each slice made a soft, almost wet sound against the wood. She didn't look up. What? Her fingers moved by. Memory, the wind returned, but it didn't howl. Brushed against the walls like a hand testing for weakness. A shutter creaked faintly. The dog lifted its head but didn't rise. The fire cracked once, throwing sparks that danced and died in the space between the stones. No one flinched. These were winter's lullabies. By midday, the stew was on again. Thick with barley and sliced roots, floating in a broth darkened by the last of the marrow saved from last week's bones, it bubbled softly, casting steam against the pot's rim. The scent was stronger today, richer, more earthy. The girl leaned over it and closed her eyes. The boy watched her for a moment, then leaned in too, mimicking her expression. Inhaled. Deeply and whispered, "Better than yesterday." She nodded. That was the highest praise they ever gave a meal. Not perfect, not delicious, but better. In winter, better was more than enough. The father returned in the early afternoon, boots covered in slush, shoulders dusted with snow. He stepped inside quickly, shutting the door behind him with care. He stood near the fire, not speaking, his breath coming in slow bursts. His hands were red from the cold, the skin cracked along one knuckle. The girl passed him a cloth without. Being asked, he took it, nodded once, and sat beside the fire, resting the basket he carried at his feet. Inside were 2 knotted branches, a bundle of dry grass, and something wrapped in linen. Maybe meat, maybe something rarer. No one asked right away. He'd show them when the time was right. The stew was ladled into bowls, the steam rising. In slow spirals, they gathered close to eat, shoulders nearly touching, the bowls warming their palms. Each bite was chewed slowly, carefully, as though to make the warmth last longer. The boy licked his lips after every spoonful. The girl blew on hers. Patient as ever, the father finally unwrapped the linen after the meal. It was a strip of cured pork, thin and dark and smoked through. The boy's eyes lit up, but he said nothing. Mother took it, divided it cleanly, and wrapped the halves again. One for now, one for later. That was how everything was done. Half now, half later. The afternoon faded into quiet again. The fire was fed, the bowls washed, the bench wiped clean. The light dimmed until the shadows stretched long and soft. The dog snored. The shutters were closed one by one. The coals glowed deeper in their bed of ash. The day, like all others, had moved slowly but surely toward rest as the night approached. The father placed another log on the fire. The children lay down first, the quilt pulled high. The mother followed, her shawl tight around her. The father came last, checking the door one final time, listening for wind. There was none, only silence, and the soft creak of a cottage that knew how to hold warmth, and so the fire settled. The breath slowed. The cold remained outside, held back not by strength, but by the slow rhythm of care. No miracles, no sudden joys, just the quiet, unshakable comfort of enough warmth, enough food, enough love to last the night. The wind returned just after midnight. Low and steady, sliding its way between rooftops like water through a crack. It didn't howl, it whispered. Against the shutters, it pressed with a gentle persistence, testing each corner for weakness, each seam for neglect. But the shutters held, wooden and worn, creaking faintly but unmoved. Inside the fire, glowed red beneath the ash, the boy stirred first, not fully waking, only turning in the blanket, pressing his cheek deeper into the straw. A corner poked his neck, but he didn't flinch. His hands tucked beneath his chin, shifted slightly. His breath fogged the air above his lips, then disappeared like smoke. Sleep wrapped itself back around him with ease. The girl's fingers had slipped from beneath the quilt, resting open near her collar. Her hair, matted slightly from sleep, lay fanned over her cheek like threads pulled loose from a shawl. Her chest rose and fell beneath the wool, the rhythm of her breath undisturbed. She didn't dream often anymore, but when she did, they were quiet dreams, made of color, not sound. The dog had changed position, now curled tight near the foot of the bed, nose tucked under its tail. Occasionally it twitched, one leg shaking. Softly, as if chasing something through snow it couldn't see, a small whimper escaped its throat. Not pain, just a sound of effort. Then it stilled again, legs wrapped tighter, breath slow. The mother was awake now, her eyes open but unmoving, watching the outline of the ceiling beam where the firelight just barely reached. Her hand rested on her stomach, palm up, fingers curled inwards. She wasn't thinking, just listening. To the creak of the walls, to the wind at the door, to the hush that came with deep winter. She rose with the kind of quiet that comes from doing it often. The quilt barely shifted as she moved. Her feet touched the floor, cold and solid, and she wrapped her shawl tighter before stepping toward the hearth. She didn't need light to know where the fire lay. Her hands knew every inch of this space. Kneeling, she lifted the poker and shifted the top layer of ash. Coals blinked to life beneath it, soft red eyes glowing from sleep. She fed them slowly, 2 small sticks first, then a curl of bark. The flames came not in a rush, but in a yawn, stretching upwards with careful grace. She watched them quietly, letting them grow. She didn't light the lamp. She liked the way the fire moved in darkness, how it gave just enough glow to shape the room, but not so much to erase the shadows. She reached for the kettle, still half filled, and poured a bit of water into a wooden cup. Steam rose, carrying the scent of iron and soot. The father had not moved, though she knew he was awake. He always was, just after her. She could hear the change in his breath. He'd stir when the fire was fuller. Till then, he'd let her work. The quiet between them was practiced, like a song sung so often its words no longer needed saying. She stood, again, stretched her arms, and moved to the small window. Just a crack, just enough to look outside. Snow had returned, but it was finer now, lighter, dancing on the wind like flowers shaken over a table. The world was still white, still cold, still beautiful in its own harsh way. The wind touched her, cheek through the gap sharp immediate. She closed the shutter again, placing her hand flat against it until the chill faded. Behind her, the fire crackled louder. The dog shifted. The girl sighed in sleep. The boy turned his face the other way, and the father finally sat up. He rubbed his eyes, then his shoulders. His hands moved slow, fingers stiff. He stepped to the hearth beside her and crouched low, holding his palms near the flame. They didn't speak, but she passed him the cup. He drank half, then gave it back. His lips pressed tight, but not with worry, just habit. Will it keep? Snowing, he asked softly. His voice sounded like wool dragged over wood. She nodded. Feels like it. He leaned forward and tossed another log into the fire. The sparks rose quickly, then faded just as fast. He watched them with the same eyes he used in the forest measuring, waiting, reading what wasn't spoken. She sat beside him on the bench, knees pulled to her chest, hands wrapped around her own cup. The fire burned brighter now, warming the corners of the room, sending gold into the folds. The girl sat up next, blinking at the light, then crawling forward on elbows to sit near the fire. Her blanket dragged behind her, catching bits of straw. She sat without speaking, leaning forward, hands open to the warmth. Her eyes followed the flame, as if it were telling her something just beyond hearing. The boy stirred last, rubbing one eye, groaning softly, then sitting up with a tuft of hair sticking in all directions. He shuffled forward, joining the others in their circle around the heat. The family sat together like stones in a ring, each one weathered by cold but warmed by the center they'd built together. The fire was now alive, not just surviving. It danced, it hissed, it whispered. The kettle rattled lightly, a sound that would always mean comfort. The stew would be prepared soon. The bread from yesterday would be warmed again. Oh, nothing new, nothing grand, just the same slow steps, walked with care. The day hadn't begun, not really, but it had stirred. The first edge of light had found its way through the shutters, painting the edge of the table in soft silver. And in that cottage, tucked deep in the belly of winter, there was no rush. No noise, just warmth, just breath, just the slow, steady heartbeat of surviving together. The stew was simple, the kind they'd eaten for days without complaint, barley thickened with roots, pinch of dried herbs, and water ladled from the bucket before it froze over. The girl stirred it slowly, watching the surface ripple and settle. The smell rose like memory, nothing rich, but warm and familiar. It's like folded wool or a mother's hands. The boy fetched bowls without being asked. Wooden and worn, the rims smoothed from years of use. He placed them carefully on the table, aligning them as if it mattered. The dog thumped its tail against the floor, then rolled onto its side, eyes half closed, already waiting for the first scraps. No words passed between them, but everything moved as if rehearsed. The father sat at the bench, tying the laces of his boots slowly, wrapping twine where the leather had frayed.
Ow.
His shoulders ached from sleep, from cold, from work that never quite ended. He'd walk to the eastern edge of the field today, too. Check if the branches near the stream still held beneath the snow. It wasn't urgent, but it was winter. Everything mattered more when cold. The mother portioned the stew into bowls, scraping the last bits from the side of the pot. Each bowl was equal, not just in amount, but in care. Even the dog's bowl had. Its place by the hearth, a small spoonful set aside, the warm scent drawing its nose up with a soft snort. The family gathered without calling. No one needed telling it was time. They sat in quiet, spoons moving rhythmically. Steam curling toward the ceiling beams where soot had long painted the wood dark. The fire cracked behind them, low and full. The father chewed slowly, the warmth moving into his chest. The heat not just from food, but from stillness. The girl closed her eyes between bites. The boy kicked his heels softly against the stool leg. After the bowls were emptied, the girl wiped, each one clean with a strip of damp cloth, setting them upside down near the fire to dry. The boy stacked kindling into a bundle, knotting it with a frayed rope. He did it clumsily, but carefully, tongue peeking from the corner of his mouth in concentration. The father nodded once, proud in silence. The dog sat at the door, ears lifted. Snow pressed against the bottom of the wooden frame, but not enough to block it. The father pulled on his coat, patched twice over the shoulder, and took his satchel from its hook. The mother handed him a cloth pouch, bread and salt. He tucked it into his coat, then kissed her forehead lightly. He stepped into the snow without hesitation, the wind meeting him like a familiar challenge. The cold bit through his coat immediately, sharp against his cheeks, but he didn't flinch. He walked slowly at first, then faster as his limbs remembered movement. His boots sank deep, each step muffled, leaving prints that filled with wind almost as soon as they were made. Inside, the cottage settled into its daily rhythm. The mother set water to boil again, this time for laundry, placing a wooden basin near the fire. The girl unhooked the cloths from the drying line, folding each one with practiced grace. The boy knelt near the wall, tracing letters into the ash with a stick, muttering their shapes under his breath. The snow outside had grown lighter, the flakes drifting more than falling, caught in a breeze that carried them sideways across rooftops and fences. The wind moved with less bite now, more like a breath than a warning, hummed faintly through the chimney, a sound they no longer heard until it stopped by midday. The fire was high again, fed with the last of the dry bark. The mother stirred the laundry water with a long spoon, testing its heat, then dipped a bundle of linens into the basin. Steam rose in thick waves. The scent of soap root, stored since autumn, filled the room a rare, sweet sharpness among all the earth and wool. The girl helped wring out each cloth, hands red from heat and damp, her sleeves soaked through. The warmth of the water on her fingers, the soft hush of fabric rubbing against wood, the sense of doing something useful, these were the closest things to comfort winter allowed. The boy handed them to her, one at a time, silent and proud. They hung the cloths from the rope above the fire, careful not to crowd them. Each one dripped slowly, droplets hissing into the coals as they fell. The dog lay beneath the hanging line, eyes closed, ears twitching with every sound. The rhythm of the home was steady now, quiet and full. Nothing rushed, nothing wasted. The mother rested her hands on the table and watched the children work. Her back ached, and the cold still crept into her sleeves. But the sight of them live, busy, warm-soothed her in ways that bread or fire could not. She didn't speak. She just breathed deeply and let the silence wrap around her like another shawl. Outside, father reached the edge of the field, the snow, thinner here beneath the trees. The stream was frozen at the edges, its center still dark and trickling. He gathered branches that had snapped in the wind, testing them for weight, for rot. The cold clung to his beard, but his fingers moved with ease now, warmed by purpose. He knelt by the bank. brushing snow from a log, revealing dark bark beneath. It would burn slowly, not hot, but long. He smiled just faintly at the thought of his daughter feeding this wood to the fire, over hands warmed by something he touched. Then he arose, shouldered the bundle, and turned back home. The wind met him again, colder now, but it didn't slow him. He knew the path. The trail of his earlier footsteps was gone, buried by snow, but his body remembered each step. The weight on his back was heavy, but solid. There was satisfaction in that a load carried not just for warmth, but for the ones waiting in the cottage glow. The door creaked open and let in a gust of cold. The children looked up. The dog barked once, then stood and wagged its tail. The father stepped inside and stamped his boots against the threshold, setting down the bundle with a grunt. The mother took it without a word, laying it near the hearth to dry. They didn't ask what he'd found. They didn't need to. The wood itself answered, each branch proof that the day had not been wasted. The girl fetched a dry log and added it to the fire. The boy brought him a bowl of warm water. The father sat, stretched his shoulders, and leaned back with eyes half closed. Outside, snow still drifted. Inside, the fire burned, and the cottage, tired and small, held its breath once more, wrapped in silence, in warmth, in the rhythm of things that held. Evening returned without drama. The sky dimmed gradually, the pale gray fading into something deeper, something more still. No golden glow, no pink across the clouds. It's just a slow thickening of shadows that told them the day was leaving again. Snow continued to fall, softer now, like dust shaken gently from an old cloth. The wind no longer pressed, it wandered. The girl stood at the window, watching flakes drift past the shutter slats. Her breath left a soft fog on the wooden frame. She touched it once with her fingertip, then turned away. The room behind her had grown warmer, fuller. The scent of stew, the hum of fire, the weight of another day done. Nothing loud, just complete. The boy lay near the hearth, drawing circles in the ash again, this time slower, more careful. His sleeves were rolled up, his elbows resting on the warm stones. The dog was beside him, chin on paws, eyes half-lidded. Occasionally its tail gave a lazy thump against the floor, stirred by dreams only animals remember. The boy didn't speak, just traced and watched the fire move. The mother placed the pot back over the flame, adding a little water, a little salt. She moved slowly, now shoulders stiff. Knees tight from bending, but each motion was steady, measured. She stirred the stew like it was a ritual. The spoon moved in wide, slow circles, keeping time with the fading light. When the food was ready, they didn't call each other. The smell alone was invitation. The children rose and took their places. The bowls were filled again with steaming broth, thickened now with oats and the last of the carrot root. Spoonful held quiet warmth, and in that quiet, they are grateful without words. The fire cast long shadows on the walls, flickering gently across the uneven surfaces. The stone near the hearth glowed dull red, warm to the touch. The window panes remained dark, reflecting only the inside now. No one looked outside anymore. The snow was still there, of course, but their world had drawn inward. After the meal, the girl gathered the bowls while the boy brought the cloth. They worked side by side in a silence that wasn't empty. It was full of care, of routine, of something older than speech. The mother wiped down the table with short strokes. The father fed the fire one more log and stirred the coals with the iron rod the cottage had settled. Not just the house, but everything inside it. There was no more to be done. No boots to dry, no rope to coil, no sleeves to mend. The stew was finished. The fire was strong. The night had come, and they were ready for it. The way you're ready for something you've survived many times before, the girl sat near the fire and began combing her hair with her fingers, slow and methodical. She separated the strands into sections not for beauty, but to keep the knots from waking her. The boy lay beside the dog, their breathing nearly matched. His eyelids drooped, but didn't close. He was waiting for the final quiet. The father leaned back and rested his head against the wall. His eyes were on the ceiling, where the firelight shimmered in small golden shapes. His body hurt, but he said nothing. He wouldn't trade the ache for a different kind of life. He knew this one. He belonged to it, was part of the wood and stone. The mother sat with her hands folded, the cloth still warm from drying. She let her gaze drift over her children, the fire, the kettle, the wall. She counted nothing, measured nothing. She simply watched the world she'd built hold itself together, even now, even in cold and hunger and silence. This was the work, and it was done well. The wind gave a single long breath against the window, then moved on. A shutter creaked once, but didn't shift. Outside, the snow had gathered on every surface, roof, tree, fence, stone. The tracks the father had left earlier were already buried. The world had no memory of movement now, only softness, only stillness. They began to prepare for sleep without speaking. The girl folded the corner of the blanket back. The boy slipped beneath it first, curling onto his side, arms folded. The mother tucked the edges near his feet, brushing crumbs from the straw before lying beside him. The dog padded over and lay at the door again, watchful, ready. The father placed the poker near the hearth, its handle still warm from his grip. He looked at the fire one last time, adjusted the logs, then stood. He removed his coat, folded it neatly, and lay down beside the rest, pulling the blanket up over his chest. His hand rested just beside the girl's elbow. No words were exchanged. The blanket shifted once more as they settled. 4 bodies curled, close breath mingling with the warmth of fire and earth and wool. The girl whispered something barely audible, perhaps a prayer, or perhaps nothing at all. The boy had already gone still. The mother exhaled slowly, her eyes closing. The father watched the ceiling until the firelight dimmed. The coals glowed, red, not fading, just resting, like the hearts of sleeping animals beneath frost. The wind passed by the cottage once more, but it didn't press hard. The snow thickened outside, soundless, relentless, gentle. It buried everything in softness, in silence, in a layer of forgetfulness. And within those 4 walls, shaped by mud, by stick, by ash, by hand, a family slept, not in luxury, not in peace, untouched by worry, but in warmth made by habit, in love made by labor, in the quiet certainty that, come morning, the fire would be fed again, and that would be enough. The night deepened, like ink poured slowly over the world. Snow fell so steadily now that even the wind gave up trying to lift it. It floated down in perfect silence, blanketing the village in a stillness so complete that time itself seemed to pause. The trees didn't move. The fences stood half swallowed. Footprints vanished as they were made, erased like words in sand. Inside the cottage, the coals pulsed low and even, nestled beneath a soft crust of gray ash. The warmth was faint now, but it lingered, clinging to wool, to breath, to skin. Quilt lay heavy over the 4 bodies beneath it. A mountain of limbs and shared heat. No one stirred. No one dreamed wildly. They simply drifted, folded into sleep like pages inside a closed book. The dog at the door kept its eyes open longer than the rest.
Ow.
It lifted its head at every groan in the rafters, every whisper of wind, then lowered it again, unconcerned. Ears twitched, but nothing troubled the night. Eventually, even that small sentinel gave in, closing its eyes and breathing deep, tail curled tight to its ribs. The cottage itself made its usual night music, cold wood creaking, snow shifting on, the roof wind slipping across stones. These weren't interruptions. They were part of the rhythm, expected and almost soothing. The house knew how to survive nights like this. It had done so for decades. The walls were crooked but loyal. They held their heat in their silence. The mother stirred once near midnight. Though not from cold, it was the same way her body woke every few hours in winter, just to listen, to feel the air, to check the fire without opening her eyes. Her hand moved under the blanket, found the boy's shoulder, the girl's arm, the father's wrist still warm, still there. She let herself drift again. Outside, the snow continued its soft descent. A full layer had gathered on the ledge outside the window, undisturbed and thick. In the yard, the woodpile wore a round white cap. The sled beside the fence was half buried. Chickens slept in their coop, huddled close, their feathers puffed, their beaks tucked beneath wings. Even the wind had gone somewhere else. The fire's glow dimmed further as the night pressed on. The hearth still held enough heat to keep the room from freezing, but just barely. Frost began to form near the edges of the window pane, feathering out in crystal veins that caught the faint light from the embers. The breath of the sleepers rose and fell gently in the flickering dark. By the time the first faint grayness of morning touched the edge of the sky, the cottage was still sealed in silence. The fire had nearly gone out, the coals a soft orange beneath a crust of cooling ash. The air had turned crisp again, though the warmth under the blanket remained, held them like a spell. The dog rose first, stiff-legged, yawning with a long dock. Silent stretch, its paws patted lightly toward the hearth, where it sniffed the stones, then turned in a circle and lay back down, head resting on crossed paws. Its eyes remained open, waiting for the rustle of footsteps, the smell of food. The start of something. The father was next, lifting himself with slow effort. Sitting at the edge of the blanket with both feet flat on the floor, he held still for a long moment, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the dark grate of the fire. His body ached from sleeping still, but it was the right kind of ache. Outside, the snow didn't fall anymore. It hung in the air like a held breath. The wind had gone somewhere else. The trees didn't move. The fences stood buried, the footprints erased. But inside the cottage, the world continued. Habit, from warmth, from the shared stillness of those who had made this life by hand and beneath it all. The fire burned again, small, steady, enough. The bowls were washed in warm water and dried by the hearth. The cloth wrung out and hung back. On its nail, the girl folded the blanket from the bed and shook out the straw beneath it, dust rising in a golden cloud that disappeared in the slant of morning light. The boy helped smooth the bedding back down, hands red from scrubbing, but quick, proud of the routine. This was the way they reset the room, quiet, precise, a ceremony of care. The mother took stock of the food left hanging in cloth pouches near the window. A few roots, 2 small onions, the heel of a loaf gone stiff at the edges. It would need stretching. She ran a thumb across the onion skin and turned it in her palm. It was just beginning to sprout. She'd have to cook it today. Nothing wasted, not even the sprouting edge of a bulb. The father sat by the fire, sharpening his knife with a flat stone, dragging the blade across it with the slow, even motion of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. His eyes were half closed. He wasn't thinking of anything in particular, only listening to the scrape, to the hiss of the kettle, to the shuffle of straw behind him. The morning didn't need conversation. It needed rhythm. Outside, the sky was clearing, pale blue pushed. Behind thinning clouds, and a faint shimmer appeared on the snow. It was the kind of morning that almost looked warm until you stepped into it. The trees were still crusted white, their bark outlined in hoarfrost, and the fences that lined the yard had vanished beneath soft rippled drifts. The girl watched it through the window but didn't open it. The fire burned brightly now, full of dry wood and determination. It made the walls glow orange and woke the shadowy corners from sleep. The dog had taken up its post near the hearth. Again, nose resting on folded paws, eyes flicking open at every sharp crack in the wood. It didn't move. It just listened. The same way the mother did. The girl fetched the heavy wool cloak from its peg and began stitching a loose button back into place. She sat cross-legged on the floor, the cloak spread across her knees, needle threading in and out with patience. The fabric was thick and stubborn, and her fingers hurt from the effort, but she didn't stop. She talked softly under her breath. As she worked half a song, half memory, the boy took a short nap near the fire. Curled on his side with one hand under his cheek, his face was flushed from the heat, his breath soft and even. The mother let him rest. He'd been waking early. Each day, helping without complaint, learning the rhythm of winter in his bones. She brushed a curl from his forehead and stood to tend the stew. Again, lunch would be light, mostly broth with bits of bread softened in the pot. The father had brought in more firewood before the sun crested, and the stack by the door was neatly arranged now, the bark dripping faintly from snow melt. Each log gave off the scent of forest, faint and sharp. It mingled with the steam from the pot. The mother took a moment to sit. She eased herself onto the stool and placed her hands in her lap. Her back ached in the usual places. Her shoulders sagged. But for a few minutes, she allowed herself stillness. She watched the girl knot the final stitch. She listened to the father sharpen. She watched her son dream near the fire. The room was full. Later, the stew was ladled into the same bowls. A bit of dried thyme crumbled in for taste. The boy stirred his with slow, sleepy circles. The girl dipped a bit of crust into hers and closed her eyes as she chewed. The father didn't look up from his spoon. It was the kind of meal that didn't need praise, quiet, hot enough. After eating, they prepared for the afternoon. Girl gathered her mending tools. The mother rinsed the bowls and hung the cloth to dry. The father pulled on his coat and stepped outside again, hat low over his brow, scarf tight to his chin. He walked to the back of the cottage, where the fence line dipped toward the woods. The snow was deep, but the air had stilled. He moved slowly, carefully, boots punching down with each step. He checked the traps he'd set near the old trail. Nothing. Caught, though one had been disturbed, likely by wind. He reset it, brushing away snow with a gloved hand, then stood still for a while. Listening to the woods breathe, from behind him, the village was quiet. Chimneys smoked gently. Rooster crowed once, far off. A crow called from a branch overhead, black against the white. It flapped away as he moved again, walking the length of the yard and returning to the house, the bundle of kindling under his arm. Inside, the warmth welcomed him like a hand on the chest. He brushed snow from his shoulders and stepped back into the rhythm. The girl had started combing through the wool pile again, sorting what could still be patched, what could be restitched. The boy was feeding the dog bits of cooled bread, one crumb at a time, eyes bright with quiet delight. The mother prepared water for washing his shirt, her apron, the boy's spare tunic. She let the water heat, then cooled it with snow, dipping the cloth and slowly wringing it out again and again. Her hands moved in circles, pressing away the soot, the skin, the smoke. The basin steamed, the fire hissed, and the house stayed warm. By late afternoon, the sky had begun to blush at the edges. The sun hung low, wide and gold, just above the tree line. Its light turned the snow to silver, the cottage roof to something. Glowing, the windows caught it too, flickering gold across the walls inside. It didn't last long, but it was beautiful. And they noticed. The girl pressed her forehead against the glass to watch it fade. The boy came beside her, leaning gently into her shoulder. The father rested a hand on the doorframe and looked out with them, saying nothing. The mother watched all three from the hearth, her hands still wet from the basin. The moment held, long and quiet, until the light sank away, and as the sky turned gray again. The fire was fed once more, the table wiped down, and the bowls returned to their place. The evening would be like the one before, and the one before that, full of the same small comforts, the same quiet labors, the same rituals that in winter meant love, not spoken, but seen. And somewhere between the fading of gold and the return of the dark, they prepared, once again, for night. The last light clung to the edge of the window for only a moment more, then disappeared behind the trees. The warmth it had given was fleeting, soft as breath on glass, but it left behind a memory in the glow of the room. The fire picked up its role again, without asking, its slow orange flicker taking the place of the sun. Shadows grew long, then wide, until the cottage felt held inside a warm pocket of dark. The girl drew the shutters closed, placed a folded cloth at the sill to keep the wind from slipping in. Her hands were careful, always careful, even when tired. The boy fetched the wool blanket from the hook by the door and wrapped it around his shoulders like a cloak. He stood there for a moment, watching the fire, lips parted, thinking of nothing at all. The mother set aside the basin and dried, her hands on the cloth that hung near the hearth. The tips of her fingers were raw from washing, the backs of her knuckles dry and red, but she didn't mind. She touched the side of the pot hanging over the fire, testing its warmth. It would be hot enough soon, enough for tea, enough for hands to curl around cups and rest. The father sat in the corner, legs stretched out, a whittled spoon in his lap. The handle was smooth but unfinished. He turned it over in his hands without carving further, simply feeling the shape of it, the weight. The tool was not yet useful, but it would be. All things in time. He rubbed the wood once more with his thumb and set it aside on the bench. Outside, the trees stood black and silent. Snow no longer fell, but the air had thickened. The cold was heavier tonight, the kind that pressed from all sides, not angry, but full. Stars began to peek out, faint and sharp, scattered across the dark like bits of broken glass. No wind, no motion, just stillness, clean and vast. Inside, the fire crackled. Low and steady, each pop and shift like a voice in the quiet. The girl began brushing her hair again, combing it slowly with her fingers, separating the strands with gentle tugs. Her eyes stayed half-lidded. The boy sat on the floor beside her, his hands wrapped around his knees, rocking just slightly with the rhythm of the flame. The mother poured water into 3 cups, placing them carefully on the table. The steam lifted gently, curling in the warm air, carrying the faint scent of dried mint. It was the last from the bunch they had gathered in early autumn, pressed between cloth and strung above the hearth for weeks. It wasn't sweet, but it was soft, and that was enough. The father took his cup with both hands and sipped slowly. He closed his eyes with the first swallow, letting the dog stretched once, then rose and padded to the boy's side, resting its head on his lap. He set his cup down carefully and began stroking the dog's ears, slow, steady motions that neither rushed nor hesitated. The girl leaned against the table, her cup still half full, eyes on the fire, but focused inward. Listening to her own quiet, the mother stood and began folding the laundry that had dried throughout the day, small pieces first, and the aprons, then the larger cloths. Each one folded with purpose, with familiarity, with care. She hummed softly to herself, not a tune meant to be heard, but one shaped from memory. Her voice barely rose above the sound of her fingers moving through fabric. The father stacked another. 2 logs near the hearth, just enough to last the night. He didn't feed them to the fire yet. That would come just before they slept. For now, he watched the coals shift and blink, breathing as though alive, steady and content. He rubbed his palms together and stood, stretching his arms overhead. With a quiet groan, the boy fetched the straw-stuffed pillows from the chest and placed them near the bedding. The girl unfolded the blanket once more, smoothing the corners with careful hands. The mother joined them, adjusting the edges, tucking the thicker side toward the window wall. Each motion was small, practiced, a dance they'd done each evening since the frost first came. The fire was stirred one last time. The new logs were placed with gentle precision, not too close, not too far, nestled among the coals like children between arms. The flames caught quickly, rising in gold tongues, casting long shadows across the stone walls. The kettle, still half full, was moved off the heat. The cups were emptied. The table cleared. The night had arrived in full. The boy crawled under the blanket first, followed by the girl. She turned on her side, her back pressed lightly to his. The mother lay beside them, her shawl still wrapped around her shoulders, hands folded beneath her cheek. The father was last, lowering himself slowly, stretching one arm over them all. His breath was deep and steady, like a bellows resting after long work. The dog lay at the foot, curled tight, its nose near the boy's toes. The fire hissed as one log shifted, sending a flurry of sparks upward before settling again. The room held its glowed in golden, flickering just enough to comfort, not enough to wake. No one spoke. No one needed to. Sleep was close. Outside, the stars multiplied. The trees held still. The world turned softly beneath a heavy sky. Somewhere in the distance, a branch cracked under snow. Then silence again. Full, thick, whole. And in that crooked little cottage, stitched together by warmth and repetition, by hands and breath and routine, sleep came. Not with speed, not with dreams, but with stillness. A stillness earned, a stillness kept, a stillness that made the long night just a little shorter. The coldest part of night came without warning, lipping between the hours like ink between cracks. Even the fire, well fed and steady, struggled to keep the air from turning sharp at the edges. The walls breathed out their stored warmth and were silent again. Frost laced the inside of the shutter slats, curling in delicate veins no one would see until morning. Still within the quilt, the family didn't stir. The dog shifted once, lifting its head to sniff at the air before settling again, nose tucked. Beneath tail, the boy murmured something in his sleep, too soft to catch, then stilled. The girl's arm draped loosely over her chest, twitched with the final flickers of dreaming. Only the father's eyes remained open, half-lidded, watching. The fire slowly dim. He was used to waking at this hour. It was when the house was quietest. He moved his hand slightly beneath the blanket, resting it on the mother's elbow, just enough pressure to remind them both they were not alone. She didn't wake, but her breath slowed, deepened. He listened to it for a long time. Breath was the only sound now, besides the faint groan of the rafters. The soft sigh of wind tracing the chimney. When the fire dipped to its lowest flame, he rose gently. No creak in the floor, no shift in the blanket disturbed those still wrapped in sleep. He crossed the room and knelt before the hearth, brushing aside the ash with the edge of a split stick. Beneath it, red coals blinked up at him, tired but alive. He fed them kindling, one sliver at a time. The flames returned slowly, licking upward with quiet purpose. He warmed his hands, his palms dry and cracked from work and cold. Then, with a satisfied nod, he added one thick log and sat back on his heels. The fire caught quickly this time, as if it too had been waiting. Its glow crept across the floor again, returning warmth to the corners. He did not return to sleep. Not yet. Instead, he sat near the fire, legs stretched, back against the wall, and watched it burn. There was something comforting in being the only one awake. Something ancient, like standing watch at the edge of a forest, or listening for wolves in the distance. He wasn't guarding them, just witnessing them, his family, his world, wrapped in breath and linen. The snow outside had frozen hard. Even from within the thick walls he could feel it, a tension in the air, a silence too perfect. No fresh flakes fell, no drips echoed. From the eaves, the wind was holding still, waiting. He imagined the trees stiff with ice, their limbs bowed and glittering, a world encased in cold and silence. In the dim glow, the mother shifted slightly, pulling the girl closer in sleep. The dog made a small huff, paws twitching again. The boy's hand emerged from the blanket, open and slack, his fingertips brushing the edge of the straw. The father smiled at that, the way a person does when they know every movement in a room, every shape in the dark. He leaned forward to stir the fire once more. Sparks rose lazily, curling upward before fading into the shadowed ceiling. He loved that sound, the pop of sap, the hiss of bark. It reminded him of summer nights long gone, of distant rainstorms, of voices by candlelight. Even in the hardest winters, the fire never forgot how to speak. After a while, lay back down, pulling the quilt over himself in one slow motion, his shoulder pressed gently to the mother's. Her breath stayed steady. The dog nestled against his feet. Again, all things settled. The house seemed to breathe with them, the walls remembering their purpose to hold. Too warm to keep. Hours passed unnoticed. Darkness thickened, then began to lift. The coals dimmed again, their edges graying. The frost on the window pane melted into droplets, tracing slow trails down the wood. Light returned, not in a blaze, but as a suggestion, gentle blue glow that filtered into the room and told the walls to stretch, corners to open. The girl woke first, as she often did. She didn't sit up, only blinked and turned toward the fire. It was down to its base again, glowing low but sure. She smiled without reason, the kind of soft expression that came only after a full night's sleep. Her hand reached for the mother's. Finding it easily in the folds of the quilt, the boy woke next. Rubbing his face into the straw and yawning so wide his shoulders rose, He didn't open his eyes fully. Instead, he rolled toward the girl, burrowing deeper into the warmth. The dog perked up and licked his hand, tail wagging once, then lay back down. Satisfied that the day had returned, the mother stirred just after. She sat slowly, drawing the blanket with her, wrapping it tight around her shoulders before reaching for the kettle. It was still warm. She moved without rush, without noise. She had survived another night. And in winter, survival felt like a kind of miracle. She brought the water to a simmer, stirring in the bits of crushed mint and bark that remained. The steam curled upward, bringing with it the smell of morning. The morning settled into motion the way smoke settles into rafters quietly, without sharp edges. No bells, no commands, just bodies moving through memory. The girl gathered the scraps of wool from yesterday's pile, brushing them smooth and arranging them into bundles by color. She wasn't told to do it. She simply knew. The boy stacked kindling near the hearth, his small hands steady now, used to the work. The father sat at the table, knife in hand, shaping a new handle for the broken iron ladle. The wood was old birch pulled from the shed during the last thaw. He whittled in slow strokes, curving the handle to fit the shape of the palm. The sound of it was a rhythm shave. Pause, turn, breathe. It filled the space like the tick of a clock that had never been built. The mother prepared a thin mash of oats and crushed chestnuts, sweetened slightly with the last spoon of honey scraped from the bottom of the jar. She stirred it without rush, lifting the spoon every few turns to let the steam rise up, fogging the dark air above the pot. The smell was plain and warm and good. It filled the cottage from wall to wall. Sunlight slanted through the window, pale and watery. It didn't bring warmth, but it brought shape-long rectangles of gold falling over the table. The bedding, the dog curled near the door. Frost still clung to the outer glass, but inside, the day had begun to hum. The fire held steady. The breath of the room was slow and full. They ate together, as always, heads bowed slightly over wooden bowls. The sound of spoons tapping gently was the only noise. No one needed to speak. They all knew the weather, the tasks, the pace. In winter, knowing each other meant saying less. The girl blew across her mash and smiled to herself. The boy wiped his nose on his sleeve and kept chewing. After breakfast, the father gathered his things: hat, rope, knife, a pouch with dried bread, and stepped outside to cut more branches from the western edge of the wood. The wind greeted him sharp and thin, but the sky was clear, the snow bright. He pulled his scarf tighter and moved with careful purpose, leaving crisp tracks that glinted behind him. Inside, the girl continued sorting wool, while the boy fetched the chipped bucket and began filling it with snow to melt for water. It was hard work, but not difficult. Just cold. He braced against the wind, face turned away, dumping armfuls into the wide pot near the hearth. Each time he rushed back inside with red cheeks and bright eyes. The mother began mending the father's coat again. The seams were pulling at the shoulder where the fabric had been strained day after day. She turned it over in her lap, her fingers brushing along the edge, counting stitches without counting aloud.
Out.
The thread was coarse, but strong. Like most things that lasted, didn't come easy. The girl finished her bundles and tucked them into the cloth sack kept beneath the bench. She pressed each one down firmly, then tied the strings in quick little knots. The sack would be taken to town once the snow allowed it. Not yet. Maybe not for many days. But still, each bundle folded with care was a promise to the future. The boy brought in the last scoop of snow and dropped to the floor near the fire, wrapping his arms around his knees. Steam was beginning to rise from the pot, curling up the side of the kettle like breath. He reached out a hand toward the warmth, letting his fingers tingle in the growing heat. A quiet sigh escaped him, one of comfort, not weariness. The mother finished the coat and laid it over the chair. Her hands rested in her lap for a moment longer than usual. She watched the steam rise. She listened to the wind press against the walls. She noticed the way her children moved, capable, steady. She didn't speak. She just let herself feel, proud in stillness. When the father returned, his boots packed with snow and a bundle of cut branches on his back. The door groaned open and brought a rush of cold with him. The dog barked once, wagged its tail, then sat again. The mother helped him unload the wood, laying each piece near the fire to dry. He nodded once, rubbing his palms together. He sat, accepted a cup of warm water, and drank it slowly. His face was ruddy from the cold, and a fine line of snow still clung to his brow. He leaned back, closed his eyes for just a second, and smiled. It wasn't relief. It was the deep breath of a man who had done what he set out to do. Nothing more, nothing less. The rest of the afternoon was slow. The girl stitched a patch onto her apron. The boy sorted nails and hooks from the tin box near the shelf, laying them out by size. The mother kneaded what little flour remained into a thin dough, letting it rest by the fire for baking. The father shaved curls of bark into the kindling pile. By early dusk, the sky had turned soft and wide again. No snow fell, but the wind had started up once, more sliding between corners, rattling the latch just enough to be noticed. The shutters were closed early. The lamp was lit, and the room filled with that quiet golden hush that only happened when the world outside was blue with cold. Dinner was a simple cake of flour and fat, crisped on the stone plate above the coals. The taste was plain, but the heat made it rich. They ate slowly, chewing in rhythm with the crackle of the fire. The boy let a bit of ash dust his fingers. The girl offered him her last bite, and he took it with a shy smile. The father wiped the plate with a scrap of bread, then passed it back to the mother, who rinsed it in the warm basin. The chores were done. The tools hung, the wood stacked. There was nothing left to fix, nothing to plan. It's just breath and warmth and rest. The dog circled its spot 3 times, then lay down with a sigh, as darkness returned, thick and complete. The girl folded the blanket once more, smoothing it out with flat palms. The boy fetched the straw pillow. The mother banked the fire. The father hung his coat and sat for a moment by the window, watching the dark settle in. And then, as if called by something quiet and kind, they all lay down. The quilt pulled up, the arms folded. The warmth passed from back to chest to hands again. The fire pulsed low, slow, steady. No one spoke. No one dreamed yet. They simply rested in the hush of a house that knew them down to the bones, down to the breath. And outside, the trees listened. The snow held its shape. The stars appeared once more, watching, waiting, whispering that tomorrow would come, and they would meet it together. The fire burned low again, its heart tucked beneath a blanket of soft gray ash. Every so often, a small flame would flicker upward, only to disappear just as quickly, like a thought remembered too late. The room was dark, save for that warm pulse of orange that still lived beneath the logs. It danced across the stone floor and painted gentle shadows across sleeping faces. The air was thick with stillness. The boy had fallen asleep first.
Oh.
His hands curled near his chest, one foot exposed just slightly beyond the quilt. The girl had followed soon after, her braid loosening in sleep, a few strands fanning across the straw. The mother lay with one hand beneath her cheek, the other resting gently on the girl's hip. The father, as always, remained awake the longest. Not by duty, but by rhythm. He stared into the fire, its slow glow catching in his eyes, reflecting a dozen winters past. There had been colder nights than this, harder ones too. Nights when the wind cried like something living, when frost bloomed, thick enough on the inside of the walls to trace with a finger, but even those had passed. Always, somehow they passed. That thought gave him peace. A log shifted in the hearth, breaking in two with a soft crack. Sparks lifted, glowing red, and vanished. The father leaned forward and nudged the pieces closer together with the iron poker. He did it gently, as if not to disturb the sleeping heat. The warmth would hold till morning, just enough to keep the frost from their lashes, the stiffness from their joints. He lay back down, pulling the blanket up over his shoulder, shifting onto his side. His hand found the mother's beneath the covers, just a brush of knuckles, nothing more. A few moments passed in silence before his breathing slowed and matched hers. Outside, the wind stirred again, soft and curious, moving through the trees. Like a wandering thought, the cottage, small and crooked and time-worn, seemed to sigh. The fire let out a final pop, and then the room fell into soft darkness. No light remained, save the faintest red coil beneath the logs. It was enough. It had always been enough. The walls, the floor, the air they had learned to hold heat in. Small ways, not from excess, but from endurance. Somewhere outside, an owl called once. Then again, its voice echoed between trees, long and low. A question with no urgency. The wind answered not with howl, but with hush, carrying the sound across the fields, between the houses, beneath the eaves. Then all was quiet again, folded back into winter's arms. The mother stirred only slightly near dawn, the kind of movement that comes from habit, not discomfort. Her eyes opened just enough to see the shape of the hearth, the color of the sky through the window cracks. She closed them again, content in the knowledge that it was not yet time to rise. The quilt was heavy, the bodies warm, the day still asleep. When morning finally came, it did so slowly, gently nudging the cottage awake. Pale light filtered through the shutters, blue at first, then golden at the edges. The frost on the windows began to melt in slow beads, streaking the glass like the tears of night slipping quietly away. The fire was only embers now, but they held. The boy was the first to wake this time. He yawned without sound, rubbed his face against the scratch of straw, and blinked at the ceiling. For a long moment, he didn't move, simply lay there eyes wide, listening to the house breathe. Then he reached under the blanket and tapped the girl's shoulder. Just once, she groaned sleepily, pulled the edge of the cover tighter, and rolled away from him. He smiled and sat up, hair wild, cheeks flushed with warmth. His toes touched the floor and immediately recoiled at the cold. He pulled them back under the quilt, laughing softly to himself, biting his lower lip to keep the sound from spilling. The dog lifted its head and gave him a sleepy look, tail thumping once against the floor. The boy reached out, scratched behind its ear, then stood slowly. He moved to the hearth and crouched beside the dying fire. The embers glowed faintly beneath the ash. He leaned close, placed a small stick in carefully, and blew. The flame didn't catch it first, but he was patient. Another breath, slow and steady. Then a flicker, a tiny flame stretching upward like a whisper. He smiled wider, added a second stick, then a third. Soon, the room began to glow again, faint and soft, like a promise. The girl joined him, her eyes still heavy with sleep, sat beside him. They sat together in front of the fire, not speaking. There was no need. Around them, the house stirred. The mother rose, rubbing warmth into her arms before crossing the room. The father followed, bending to add a heavy log to the fresh flame. The mother kissed the top of the boy's head, then ran her fingers through the girl's hair. Soon, the kettle would boil. The pot would be filled again. Smell of mash and bread would fill the corners. But for now, in this small hour between night and morning, between breath and purpose, the family simply sat, together, safe, warm in the hush that only winter gives. And outside, the snow waited, quiet, unmoved, shining in the new light like a world made of silence. The kettle began to hum before it whistled, a soft metal breath rising into the rafters. The mother leaned over it, hands wrapped in cloth, and lifted it from the hook with practiced grace. She poured slowly, the stream of hot water splashing into the waiting basin, releasing curls of steam that made the room feel even smaller, even softer. The smell of iron and heat mingled with the wood smoke. Wrapping the morning in comfort, the girl fetched the basin and placed it near the hearth. Her hands dipped in first, red and stiff from the night, but the warmth pulled a sigh from her lips. She washed with slow motions, letting her palms rest beneath the surface longer than needed. The boy followed, crouching beside her, eyes wide as he plunged his face in. Water splashed, laughter muffled behind cupped hands, then faded back into quiet. The father had already gone outside, boots crunching beneath the snowpack, breath rising in clouds that drifted above the fence posts. The sky above was pale, colorless, as if waiting for something. He moved to the shed at the edge of their yard, pulling open the warped wooden door to check the dried stores turnips, salted meat, old apples shriveled but whole. He made a mental note of what remained. Inside, the mother had begun slicing the last of the bread. It was hard now, almost too dry to cut,